But it's interesting how this perception that something is coming, Trump's going to announce something, something's going to come in 2027. The Antichrist is coming, according to Peter Thiel. All of these things create a context where there's not much time left. There's this urgency, this sense that, things aren't going to last very long, that, economically, that disaster's looming, war is looming. I think we should be very conscious of the fact that that might be intentional, whether it's coming from groups out there that want to manipulate the future of human evolution, whether they're human groups or non-human groups. I don't know. It might not be happening, but I would be very wary of anyone who tells you that something's going to happen soon. I would behave as though it's not going to. The claim is Redfern met with people from the Air Force who claim to be part of something called the Collins Elite, which is this group, which they claim started in the late 40s, pretty much as soon as the UFO phenomenon began to appear. Through the book, the claim is the occult correlations were absolutely there and that these things are biblical demons. And that's what that group began to believe. The whole idea is that the end times are now here. Parsons appears, he summons these entities, and they've broken through into our reality. And that this is the deceptive end times thing, because Satan and his hordes are playing one final trick on humanity. And the trick is this: we're going to masquerade as an extraterrestrial intelligence. We're going to come and tell you that all of your religions were wrong. Christianity wasn't quite right. Here's how the universe really works. And they're going to trick us into believing that, like, sort of antichrist belief system. And so, it sort of then integrates with the biblical view of the end times. And so that's the whole idea of the Collins Elite.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. A new generation of researchers has appeared over the last few years, taking their place alongside the names who have studied and reported on this subject for decades. What I find interesting is many of these names are not only looking into the topic differently, but they all present the information differently too, bringing a lot of complicated, strange, and sometimes uncomfortable threads into a format people can actually follow. And one of those researchers I believe will be around for a long time still to come is joining me today. Welcome to the podcast, Jason Samosa. Jason, how are you?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks. Keeping cool. How you doing?
I am keeping cool. Peek behind the actors curtain, folks, both based in the UK. So we are doing an early morning recording here before we boil to death later in another UK heatwave. So yeah, but no hydration breaks here like folks have seen in the World Cup. We're going to go straight through, going to be hardcore. But yeah, this is going to be an interesting one. And I've just been telling Jason, in preparing this, I wasn't too sure for quite a while how to go with it because there's so much to cover. If you're familiar with Jason's work, and we're going to go into his background in a moment, you'll know Jason has covered a wealth of aspects of the UFO topic, haven't you, already? And what do we start with on this? So I've decided to do a little bit of a timeline because one of my favourite YouTube shows and podcasts for years now is Sean Oliver's Kayfabe and Into the Territories. It's a wrestling podcast, and they go through the years and decades of a manager or a wrestler's career. And we're going to kind of try and do that as best we can here using Jason's knowledge and research and the wonderful stuff he's done. But before we get to UFOs, Jason, let's, for anyone unfamiliar with you, what's your background and what's kind of brought you to the UFO topic?
So I've got a few different things I've done in my life. Actually, I've made a few changes. So when I was about 19, I had a very sudden conversion to Christianity, which caught everybody in my life off guard. That was not something that I was brought up with. I thought Christianity was silly. But just through a whole bunch of stuff, ended up becoming very religious and actually trained to become a minister. For about 6 years, I was just every single day studying the Bible, studying everything around the Bible, first century history, systematic theology, all of that stuff. And then lost my faith in about 2015, quite suddenly. Again, unexpectedly. I then entered about a 10-year period of working in software, doing sales and marketing, traveled the world, and got to really see how businesses actually operate, how they really work. Got a lot of experience also selling, which I wasn't really aware of just what a huge skill that is. I don't mean that in terms of like communication. I mean that in terms of understanding how big organizations make changes, how large organizations like make decisions, which
Yeah.
turns out to be really useful when you're trying to understand a large organization like, I don't know, the Department of War, for example. There's a lot of psychology that's involved there and interdepartmental sort of logistics. Ended up doing sort of marketing, and then I actually wrapped up just a month ago my whole career in software, and now I'm full-time doing the YouTube channel and research in all the things we're going to talk about. So been through a bunch of different stuff. In the midst of that, I also studied philosophy. So I've kind of swung all over the place, but this is the most aligned and happiest I've ever been, is knowing I can spend all of my time researching the things that we're going to talk about. So yeah.
And that's incredible. And there's a few things there, though, I do want to dig into very quickly, because it'll help frame a lot of the discussion. That religious background, what was the sudden change that made you think, I'm going to take up Christianity? And then what was it in 2015 that flipped the other way, that you were like, oh, nope, I'm done?
Yeah, the going into Christianity was about a few things. Funnily enough, I'd actually been studying the UFO issue back then, although I use the word studying lightly because I didn't have, I hadn't like studied philosophy yet. I hadn't been rigorously trained in how to build arguments. And so I was kind of just absorbing information without being very critical about it. And that led me to be, frankly, incredibly pessimistic about the world. And I began to see everything in quite an apocalyptic lens. It was kind of like, we're facing this huge crisis. There's this huge deception going on. And then someone explained, I just came across these videos about Christianity and I was like, yeah, whatever. But they explained it in that context. They explained that, there's this apocalyptic thing going on. Here's what Jesus taught. Now it's like, actually, the things Jesus taught were really beautiful. They really struck a chord. It was the first time I'd ever paid attention to it. And I found that deeply moving, his teachings. But then it was what you would call the eschatological worldview, this worldview that there's an impending end and that there's a great deception associated with it. And someone who must have been looking at the Collins elite, who we're going to talk about, actually, no, they were looking at a guy called, I think, Michael Heiser, presented Christianity and the UFO issue in that lens when I was about 19. And they said the UFO issue is a deception designed to steer us away from God. And I bought into it. And so what happened was, it was a combination of just the right thing at the right time. I already had the right views necessary for all of that to make sense. And then there was also this profound illumination, which I think actually anyone can have by reading, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, which it felt like the answer to everything I was looking for. So that's what got me in. It was quite an emotional thing. And then afterwards, I built my sort of philosophical underpinnings for it. What happened was, when I was 25, I'd been full steam for about 6 years, and I was about to train to become a minister. I was basically the young guy in the church who was about to become the next leader. And I started to preach, and everyone was very enthusiastic about what I was doing. And I was just ready to go full steam ahead. I wanted to study Greek, study Hebrew, and just really get into all of this stuff. And a very wise man at the church called Viv, wonderful guy, he sat me down and he said, what you actually need to do is to take a year out and go and get a normal job, go and get out of this context, keep preaching, keep doing all the stuff you're doing, but live a little bit outside of this world. And in 1 year, if you're ready, we'll do it. We'll fund you. Because it was expensive. They were worried that I was just full of steam and I wasn't really ready. Yeah, I hadn't really been anchored. I'm grateful for Viv every day of my life, because he was so right. I wasn't really in, because the moment I went out, I got a job in a call center, and I was exposed to normal people in Hull. By the way, most people outside of England won't know Hull's a very working class town with just very real people who they don't have big plans or aspirations. They're just ordinary people getting on with their lives, doing what they need to do. And I was exposed to all of these people, and I realized everything I'd been learning about these people in the Bible was maybe a bit exaggerated. There's a letter called Romans in the New Testament, which describes all people as fundamentally sinful. They hate God. They've turned away. They deserve his judgment. And I was just like sitting next to Larry, and I was like, Larry, what do you think about God? He was like, to be honest, I don't really have time to think about that. I've got 3 children. I'm going through a divorce, and I'm working 6 days a week. And I was like, whoa. Yeah, maybe Larry doesn't hate God. Maybe he's just really busy. And I just began to view everything slightly differently. So I just ended up leaving there, moved down to London and started my life in sales. And I never truly stopped believing. I just got to a point where I realized there was a bunch of things in there I just couldn't believe. And the biggest one being, is the Bible really the word of God? Like, is it literally word for word? Everything in it is completely true. And I just thought that's an impossible thing to argue for. I think what you can argue for is it's a beautiful book with some amazing things, some pretty weird stuff as well. And it's important, but I don't think it's everything, and should be the fundamental kind of building block of how you see the world. And that's kind of where I ended up. So yeah, it's the short, condensed version of the story.
Yeah, we've got some crossover there. Very briefly, my background has been in contact centers and call center work. My day job is still training people in sales in a call center, which is
man after my
call
own
centers
heart.
in the UK. Yeah, they're dying out in the UK just because of AI and all that kind of stuff. Time for them to go. But even like my very quick Hull aside is how big a part Kingston Communications, if you're based in Hull and know what that is, was a thing for me in my job, folks. So yeah, that's really interesting background in sales. And religion go hand in hand, because I think some of the best salespeople I've ever seen on a television are some of the preachers and pastors that are in these huge churches on stage, and they are not preaching, they are selling, and they are selling well. Like, and there's a huge crossover there, I think, into various things. And we're probably going to skip by a lot of the early religious stuff. We could do whole episodes, and you cover that kind of stuff around going back biblically in various books. And I've learned a lot even from watching some of your stuff when you were on with Pavel from Psychoactivo podcast, and you talk about the Bible. The Bible's not a book, it's a collection of books, you know, the original DVD box set, going back. And we're going to
I
kick
love
off.
that. That's great. The original DVD box set.
It is. It's like 24 for the normies back in the day. But we're going to kind of kick off with the 1940s. And right now, I'm looking at World War II because I'm watching the World War II documentary with Tom Hanks that's currently on Sky, and it's really good. Really good deep. And it's not a deep dive. It is and it isn't, because it fires through stuff pretty quickly, but it's presented so well and repackaged. So I'm into that just now. So let's go to there. When people hear Nazis and UFOs, they think so many different things. What's your take on the UFO topic going back to that time period, the 1940s?
Yeah, I think there's a whole story here which isn't told very well. And I think we have this kind of false dichotomy of, people will say, if the Nazis were building this advanced stuff, surely they would have used it in the war and we would have seen it. And then on the other end, they say they developed so much technology, they flew to space and, went, interplanetary.
Yeah.
But there's a middle ground. And, one of the best people to help with that actually is Jacques Vallée, who does a wonderful, his incredible book, Messengers of Deception. And there's this wonderful bit in it where he's speaking with someone he calls Major Murphy, who is clearly indicated to be a very senior person from the army, potentially actually a general, but we don't know his real name or his real rank. And Major Murphy says to him, by 1943, we knew that Germans and actually other countries were working on disc-shaped craft. We knew that. But the real thing here is, what was discovered was that these discs weren't necessarily able to fly that well. They could fly, but they weren't that stable. They couldn't hold weapons. They weren't going to be great for like transport or putting people in, at least at this stage. What they could do, though, is they had an adverse side effect, which was incredibly interesting. And that was that these discs basically gave off a kind of radiation or a certain wave frequency whenever they were in the area that affected how people perceived the world around them. So if you imagine the disc comes along, it hovers over the top of you, and suddenly your ability to perceive reality is being changed. And given all the advances in MK Ultra and everything that might have happened during the war and after the war with what the Nazis were doing, that becomes a whole other avenue through which to view advanced disc sort of capabilities. What if the real story here wasn't, we're going to build a UFO and fly into space? What if it's, we're going to build a disc-shaped craft and fly your mind to another place? So that's a really interesting middle ground where you've got sort of a view on this stuff, which is kind of different to how you perceive it. But I absolutely think you've got to take that with the overwhelming testimony that comes from the field as well. And your friend Graham, is it Graham Randall, who's done the amazing books?
Yep.
Yeah, Randall. I read his book on UFOs before Roswell, where he does a whole section on the Nazis, and he's relatively critical of the testimony that came out. He says a lot of these people were claiming to have built discs because they wanted to be flown over to America, because they wanted people to think they were these geniuses, right? So they were making up these stories. I don't know that I buy into that fully. I understand the logic. You just have so much testimony. You have Rudolf Schreiber, Klaus Habermohl, Richard Mieter, all claiming to work on discs with a center component which has a rotating outer rim. You have Wilhelm Voss, who was running the Skoda works where Hans Kammler was working. You have a guy called Epp, who also was creating something. Just recently in the new Trump drops that we've had, there was a declassified letter of someone, I can't remember his exact name, but it began with E, and he came over to America and blew the whistle as well. This is a completely new figure. There are so many different people. And then, of course, you've got the Schoberger stuff, the Horton brothers. There is so much testimony of advanced craft being developed in the war in Nazi Germany. Then you've got the Valet testimony as well. Now, the question is, what happened to it and where did it go? And I think with that, you've got to have a slightly more nuanced answer to it than just it went to Russia and it went to America. Because you've got Operation Osauervakim, I forget the Russian one, but they took more scientists than we got actually over there. And there was certainly a lot of people saying that they got some really good people in terms of the disc stuff. So some of the people who came out talking about this advanced disc craft said that the people were taken to Russia. So that's interesting. Then there was obviously about 1,600 in America. Who knows what the real number is? But the real event that you've got to grapple with is, like, by the time we came in and crushed over like Europe, so you've got General Patton steams into Europe, the Russians steam in, and we kind of meet somewhere around Berlin. That's 1945. In 1944, August of 1944, half a year earlier, there was a meeting at the Maison Rouge Hotel in Strasbourg where all of the leading German industrialists, many of whom, by the way, had lots of friends in America. They were friends with the Rockefellers, with the Dulleses. They had all of these industrial connections from before the war and even during the war. They met in Strasbourg and said, it's time to do a mass evacuation. And it sounds mythical, you know, when you read about it, it sounds sort of like, could this really have happened? But Peter Levender dug up really important documentation from the State Department that shows that it did happen. This pre-evacuation, before we got into mainland Europe, I think it was the State Department, it might have been the Treasury Department. What they found, they were doing a Senate hearing on the elimination of German resources for war. And what they identified was that already by July of 1945, this is 2 months after the end of World War II, they had identified 750 subsidiaries had been set up in neutral countries by German industry. 750 subsidiaries. There was also hundreds of tons of gold missing by the time the final search was complete. It turns out 500 tons of gold were transferred from the Reichsbank down to Brazil. That's just one transaction. That's worth $70 billion in today's money. 50 U-boats were missing. And there was just all the scale of what happened, given that the Allies were supposed to be watching and trying to stop this, the scale of what happened is so vast that it's beyond suspicious. So for me, this is really important because when we look at what happened to this advanced disc technology, you can absolutely say some of it ended up in America, some of it ended up in the Soviet Union, but I think some of it ended up in rogue third countries, in Argentina, certainly in Egypt. There was a lot going on after the war. And in terms of the UFO stuff, I'm quite confident of that. And this was kind of happening with the informal understanding of very high-powered people from the United States, but it wasn't necessarily reporting into the United States in a formal way. And I think that it's not out of the question for me that some of this most advanced stuff was taken away, continued development occurred, and I don't know that it's possible for us to get really tangible view of quite what happened next. But given that they had a chance 6 months before General Patton arrived to get all the best stuff out, and we saw that mass evacuation, it's beyond doubt to me that whatever was really going on was taken away.
From the First World War to the Second World War, aviation changed dramatically. Again, that's something I've been watching in this documentary. Just the types of craft used, the speeds, the maneuvering that could be done. You now had craft that could fly 300 miles per hour. They were using strategic bombing. Why then, with the change in aviation, with the standard aircraft becoming so much more, because you're used to the First World War, those planes with the two sets of wings and the structures holding the wings together, and they're flying over, and they could carry limited payloads, and they had the guns attached, to now these huge bombers that could take off, land, fly, huge, like huge numbers of craft as well. But then you've got the Germans developing advanced saucer-shaped craft. Why is that even happening? It seems such a sidebar to be looking
Yeah.
into when aviation's going one way. What was it happened?
You know, I think this is where it's really good to think about the philosophy of science. So the philosophy of science is actually, I think, a very important topic. You don't need to be an expert in it, but to do some basic grappling with it when you're trying to understand the sort of the history of technology, especially in the last 100 years. And there's a specific philosopher called Thomas Kuhn who proposed this idea of scientific revolutions and paradigms. And what he argued was science operates within paradigms. So right now, I mean, in the past, it was we were in a Newtonian paradigm. And what happens is that paradigm gets built, and over many years, everyone begins to believe that it is science. So everything inside of the Newtonian paradigm was true, and anything that was anomalous or couldn't be explained by it must be false. But eventually, you begin to realize by looking at the anomalies, by looking outside of the paradigm, that's how you're going to advance, because it eventually isn't big enough to deal with all the data you're seeing. And so then we have the Einsteinian paradigm, which is bigger. Now, the reason I'm explaining that is this. Einstein's philosophy was fundamentally Jewish, right? So, I mean, science isn't Jewish, but Einstein was. And so for the Nazis, who had a very strong German heritage in their science, I think there was some resistance to taking a normal path with science anyway. So that's one component where there was some sense that they are on their own path, that they were a superior race. And so therefore, I guess there might have been more willingness to break outside of the boundaries of traditional science. This is the paradigm that the West is using, but we're different. So why don't we create Aryan science? And I don't know if it's in Nick Cook's Hunt for Zero point that he discusses this idea that there might be a sort of another lineage that they were trying to create. And who knows how successful it was. But funnily enough, it's that willingness to dare to engage in the anomalies and to look outside of the existing paradigm, which sometimes can lead to breakthroughs. So that's one thing. Another thing is, historically, the Germans weren't just, they weren't just sort of anti-Jewish. They were also, I think, rejecting a kind of scientific, logical materialism, which had embraced Europe at this time. There was this tendency at this point to say, okay, well, scientific truth is all we really have access to. And so all of this old sort of philosophical, theological stuff must therefore be lower on the scale of truth. And I think if you look at what the Nazis were doing, they were very willing to engage with mythology and to engage with these kind of concepts that might have been trounced on at the time. They had a very romantic view. I mean, you don't think of the Nazis as being romantic, but a sort of a different view of the world where I think those kind of other ideas, those sort of mythological different ways of viewing the world were allowed. And again, it doesn't mean that their ideas about like world ice theory or whatever crazy things they believed in were true. But again, by being willing to believe in stuff that's slightly out there, they might have stumbled across some interesting stuff. And then I just also think, this isn't a racial thing, but I just think, like right now the World Cup's on. As you're well aware, Andy, I saw your post the other day saying that you're currently feeling Mexican. I'm not sure if you're feeling Mexican
Norwegian,
anymore.
sorry, Norwegian.
Norwegian now. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's Norwegian next. Yeah. Fair play. But the World Cup shows us that like certain teams are just better at certain times. Like right now, the French team is phenomenal. And I think if you go back to the early 1900s, it's inarguable that the German scientific tradition was just phenomenal. I mean, so many of the great scientists beyond Einstein were German. And so there might have just also have been a fuel there of eagerness to explore and to go further. But all of that's guessing. I don't know why or if, but those are some reasons I think why the Germans might have ended up having a sort of maybe some interesting discoveries.
That makes a lot of sense. So for me, again, who's a bit of an idiot, you're looking at the world was largely, in Europe particularly, looking at one way of things in the West. You then have the Germans who have these radical ideas, many radical ideas, as we know, but through that, they stumble upon some very out the box thinking, some very left field attempts at things that may be unethical, immoral. Not that we weren't doing that kind of stuff. I always think when it comes to this kind of thing, the victors of the war write the history, don't they? So I can't imagine the amount of things that the Allies done that won't ever see the light of day because we won. Whereas had the Nazis won the war, no doubt you wouldn't have heard a lot of the atrocities that they committed, but you would have heard about things the Allies done. So I'm sure those go hand in hand. But then obviously you have, like you say, the Allies win. Russia gets its tranche of scientists. There's that word tranche that we've been using the last month or two with the UFO drops. The UK, the US, Operation Paperclip, you get so many folks come over. And it's just then you've got a lot of these ideas, these ways of thinking now come into the West, and the Allies begin to expand. And I suppose it's no surprise then from the 40s onwards, we have this explosion with the UFO conversation taking place that seems to then go hand in hand. We're recording this on the 8th of July, which is one of the Roswell anniversary dates. There, depending on what timeline you believe in and how things may have happened. Where does Roswell for you fit into this early timeline and just coming out of that Second World War?
So in terms of Roswell, one thing's for sure, something happened, because you wouldn't get so many different stories coming from the government about it if something hadn't happened. There are people out there, I mean, Tom DeLonge at one point was saying that he thought Roswell was German. Joseph Farrell has suggested a similar thing. I don't know. I find it strange to believe that if they were developing this advanced tech, that it would have been flown over America. I don't know why you would have done that. If you were a genuine breakaway at this point, which I'm not sure would have been happening quite yet, but if that was some sort of rogue element, why would you fly your fantastic new craft whilst it's still sort of relatively new over America? If you're actually like allied with the Americans in building this, maybe that makes more sense. But then there's what was found inside, which again is curious. And I actually, on a talking point here, have you read Jacques Vallée's novel Stratagem?
No, that's one of the ones I haven't.
It's actually a great read. It's not. I'm not saying Vallée is like a world class, like amazing fiction writer, but it was solid, entertaining, and especially if you're interested in UFOs, it really keeps you going. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting part in there where the main character comes across someone who basically indicates that there were experiments that have been done to create alien bodies, fetuses, out of human experimentation. And I think that's something I take seriously. And I don't know whether that might have been happening already in Nazi Germany or in Japan. I really want to look into this. I mean, I don't want to, obviously it's horrible, but it's a topic that seems important. So I do wonder about that. Is it possible that so-called alien bodies might have been, experimented on? I think Annie Jacobsen said something similar. So I'm open to that. But to be honest, Roswell's a puzzle to me. I don't really know what's going on, especially because one of the most entertaining things to me about Roswell is so many people who have a degree of credibility have different views on it. And that strikes me as the real intention here is just to confuse us. So I'm going to remain confused. What's your take, Andy? I'm curious.
On Roswell, it would appear to me that something crashed that wasn't human. The story is so muddled because I've heard over the years one disc crashed. I've heard that a second disc also crashed sometime after. They were perhaps coming back to retrieve the first. You get the idea, and this builds into a little of what you were saying around your post-war Nazi scientists coming over to the United States in various guises. Were they testing something? Does that mean it was still human or non-human related? We don't know. I still subscribe to the idea that something crashed. They recovered non-human bodies, and from there, it kind of kicked off. I suppose what I wonder then, given what you've said kind of so far and building off of that World War II period ending, is it the case that the UFO topic happens the way it does because of the end of the Second World War, is there a consequence and a breeding ground for the national security states, for the way the countries then begin to view the world, view themselves, view safety, view different partnerships? Is that a really good breeding ground for secrecy that causes the UFO topic? Or is it just like a
Mm.
happenstance that UFOs become a thing around that time? Obviously Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the testing of atomic weapons, largely influence for many. And I would subscribe to that too. The idea that these weapons going off send out some signals, whether it's something far away or something next door that we knock on the door accidentally or
Mm.
deliberately. I don't know, but it just seems like a perfect breeding ground for the topic to launch, but also be controlled and the narrative be kind of shaped really early on.
Yeah, I think there's probably two things going on. I think there's definitely the human development of craft that's getting mixed in, and I think the scale of what was developed probably is more than people realize. Not that I know that. I'm not saying like you guys don't know. I'm on the inside, but I do think that the technology developed will always be far more than what we're currently aware of, and I suspect a surprising amount of activity could have been that, but I also, I feel like I always butcher when I try and relay Chris Ramsey's explanation of what the phenomenon might be. And I don't think it's his only explanation, but he explains this one really well. So I'm going to try and relay it. This idea that if you're an advanced species, that you kind of want to, you might send out probes to try and manage and contain other planets. I actually I don't even want to credit this to Chris Ramsey because I might be butchering this, but in my mind, it's like you can spread out these probes. If I'm an advanced species, my biggest risk is that something else appears that's a threat to me, and it's
Mhm.
far away enough and it has enough time to develop capabilities. And so I would want to develop a huge automated system to go and scour everything around me, to identify planets that have life, and then to basically put a wall around them, to create a system that keeps them in a state of sort of conflict or a cycle where they can't advance. And it might be that if such a thing like that is happening, if we genuinely are under a control system, which maybe was created by something that doesn't even exist anymore for all we know, but then as our technology develops exponentially and as our conflict grows exponentially and we become more and more unstable, you might expect the control system to change and for certain things to begin to happen more and for more and more sightings to occur because it's working overtime. And I certainly think that even if it's not a control system, if it's just something that's trying to manage us, that would explain, the maybe significant increase in sightings, along with the nuclear connection, right? Specifically, nuclear technology is interesting. So I do find that kind of compelling that we certainly probably saw that happening. And alongside that, I think our own technical development was very likely going on. And so there's a huge gray area there about, which one's which and what's really going on.
I like that idea of the kind of out of control system, almost, that you had this control system that's no longer monitored, or and it's just been allowed to go on. And is it perhaps almost a malfunction of itself, that it's the sightings increase, the sightings change, it's running itself now? That's a really interesting idea. Um, yeah, I've got Chris Ramsey on the podcast next week, so that's something I can maybe dive into him a little bit more with.
Yeah, ask him. I think he was on with Matt Beal, and Matt Beal just asked him. And I remember thinking, oh God, I bet he's going to hate this question. It's too big. Matt Beal just asked him, like, what do you think's really going on? And Chris spoke for 20 minutes, and it was a fantastic explanation, a coherent explanation of a lot of different things. So just ask him. I'm sure he'll
You
spill
know,
it out.
on that, a really popular theory is this von Neumann probe idea, that something has sent out probes into the galaxy, self-replicating, or the solar systems, and what we have here are self-replicating robots that are building craft or are the craft, and all these ideas. Avi Loeb isn't the most popular guy at the minute. Part of the council heading up the security, the scientific council that's been set up. But he suggested when I spoke to him that, maybe we're the probes. Are we the von Neumann probes, that we have been sent to the planet and we are self-replicating, and we are actually, the alien species on the planet that's spreading. And that
Wow.
makes a lot of sense because, yeah, we are biological, we're self-replicating, we're kind of self-sustaining.
We have a
Uh,
code, right? We have a
yeah,
DNA code. Yeah, yeah.
it fits in, and I like that idea too. So you're getting all these really interesting ideas now coming out. They could all still be wrong. Some of them could be right. But I find that pretty intriguing in terms of, are we perhaps the objects themselves? Maybe
That's
we're
a
being looked
terrifying
after.
thought. That's an
Yeah,
absolutely terrifying thought. Because then we go from like being the victims of a system to having our very like our own purpose being questioned, right?
yeah. And then
Yeah.
if any of this phenomenon on this planet is sort of biological itself or whatever it may be, these craft, and like the movie Nope, where the craft is actually biological and it's hunting and it's feeding, you know, if some of these objects on this planet, on Earth, are a response to us, again, is it the case that we are the intruding thing, the object, we are the alien object, and it's Earth itself looking at us going, what is this? What's it doing here? This wasn't here before. Like you say, UFOs, and this is just 100 different theories we're spouting now, but it's fun. If UFOs are a control system to look after this planet, set up by something that was here a long time ago and is either gone or is going to come back, or they basically left the house and set the security system. And while they were gone backpacking around Europe or the galaxy or other galaxies, we turn up because we were sent here by some other species. And cosmically, we've only been here X amount of thousands of years. And this other thing's only away on vacation. And you've got the security system looking at us going, what is this stuff that's appeared in our house while we've been gone?
Mm.
That's an interesting idea and a way to look at it.
Yeah. Another one, just as you were saying that, I was thinking about this, the idea of the balance that we have with the planet. Something I've been curious about is the abduction phenomenon kind of treats us like we're cattle. It collects us, does things to us, and drops us off. And I often wondered, like, what if everybody on the planet stopped treating the Earth like it was just a resource, stopped treating animals like they're just cattle? Would the phenomenon in kind change its relationship to us? Would we stop being abducted? So I find that interesting to consider, like, if it's a control system, what if it's reacting to certain things that we're doing to the planet? And maybe if we were more balanced, it would have a different type of relationship to us. Complete speculation. I'm sure someone can come up with a reason why that's not the case, but I've always been curious about that.
Yeah, no, I like that kind of almost an immune system response, that we're a little bit of an issue and the Earth's the body and it's looking after us, and these things are the antibodies and we are the Agent Smith in the Matrix, humans are a virus,
Yeah.
It goes back to that. So, but listen, let's come out the 40s and move into the 50s. And you're in a period now where the Cold War is heating up. US government's trying to work out, this flying saucer thing. Is it foreign technology? Are we dealing with misidentification, psychological panic? What starts to happen through the 50s from your research that the UFO topic moves out of that kind of 40s Roswell crash, the initial cover-up? What begins to take shape? Because this is a kind of period I know very, very little about, in terms of, everyone knows Roswell and what happens. You then go into like the 60s, 70s with Carter and co. What happens in this period? It seems quite formative.
Yeah. I'm not like a deep expert on the 50s, but I do think one thing that's interesting to me is to consider that sometimes people are trying to figure out the government knew the UFO issue was real and it was hiding it from the people. I think that there's multiple layers to this. So firstly, there is the Soviet threat. So let's just deal with that first. I made a video on this where I really got my head around like trying to understand that Cold War context, because for us younger people, we just are not aware of it. A great example of this is I think it's the Verona project, where even during World War II, there was a project set up to decrypt Soviet communications. Whilst we were still allied with them, there was this sense like, okay, well, the war is going to end soon. We need to make sure that we're on top of these guys. We know what they're talking about. The moment they decrypted it, they found that the Soviets had been spying on the Americans already for years and knew all of their secrets. So the Cold War paranoia was starting during World War II. After World War II, it's discovered that people in unbelievably senior roles across the United States government are Soviet spies. And so even Truman is like, he's looking left, he's looking right. It's like, this guy I trusted for all these years was a spy for the Soviets. this person in this department who had access to pretty much everything. So I think there was this sense that the floor was falling out from underneath them. And then the UFO thing happens. And there's definitely, I think there's definitely an awareness that some of it is non-human. And there's also an awareness that some of this is probably human technology. The intensity of what was going on there was wild, I think. So you've got to put yourself in their shoes. What do you do in that situation? Your air defenses are being breached. Your enemy has breached every component of your environment. You don't know whether the things that are being flown might be theirs. You're not sure how much of it is yours, how much of it is something else. So saying anything at all would be so destabilizing and unhelpful, given that you don't even know the basic facts and you're probably moments away from being completely compromised as a power. So I do understand the trajectory in the late 40s into the 50s towards total lockdown and secrecy. That's one thing. But there's another component here, which is the layers of knowledge in what we call the United States government. I think were deeply fragmented. And, you know, to give you an example of this, in Captain Ruppelt's book, you know, where he's talking about after he's worked for Blue Book, he writes his report on flying saucers and what was really going on in Project Sign, Grudge, Blue Book. And he talks about that initial wave of sightings in 47 and how the government and the Air Force Technical Intelligence Command responded to it. And he's highlighting that, you know, at first they were trying to figure out, was it Navy? And then they're trying to figure out, could it be Soviet? And then they're trying to figure out, you know, could this be Nazi? And I find what's really interesting about that is when they were looking at the Nazi stuff, they specifically went hunting for the Horton brothers. I just think that's very strange because of all the people who might have really had the breakthrough, was it the Horton brothers? Wasn't there a lot of other stuff going on that would have been more compelling? Like, I don't know, like looking at the Schauberger stuff or trying to figure out what were, I don't know, Voss and Shriver and Mita and all these other people doing in different places around the world. How many of them were in
quickly, Jason, can you quickly tell us who the Horton brothers and the Schaubergers are, just for folks who may not be familiar?
Sure. So the Horton brothers were two quite famous brothers who made the Horton Wing, which is this really aerodynamic looking aircraft. It kind of looks like it's from the future in the 40s. And so they were working for the Nazis. The Schauberger, Austrian inventor who had this really sort of novel idea of an inverted propulsion system where it like, I'm really not a physicist, but it's like it sucks air inwards and creates this vortex. And it sounds like magic, but the Nazis clearly thought there was something to this. Mm-hmm. He'd already developed some really novel ways of like moving water around and everything. And he was, after the war it was discovered, had been asked to work on various disc-shaped craft with that propulsion mechanism. And then Shriver, Mita, Habermal, these are all the people who came out after the war saying they'd worked on disc-based technology. So my point is the Air Force Technical Command is looking at a very specific instance, which is probably the lowest likelihood to account for what all this stuff that's going on. And it's almost as if they just don't know the scale of the Nazi operation and where it might have ended up. So I think what you've got is you've got the public, you've got the front-facing kind of public messaging coming out. You've got the people doing that messaging, but they don't even have access to all the information. Below them, you've then got things like Project Stork, Operation Stork, which turns out to be this deeper program, which we discover, which was like deeper than Blue Book and what was going on there. But below that, you've got whatever was going on with the Nazis and this kind of breakaway stuff that had been extracted after the war, which some Americans were clearly sanctioning. So I just think there are these layers of knowledge. There's this onion of understanding. So when we look at the 50s, it's very easy to look at certain groups and say, you're covering it up. But I don't think it's that simple. I think the people who had an understanding of all of those layers probably were a very small group of people, which I'm still piecing that together. But I find there are many layers of that to be fascinating.
Controversial, unpopular take here, but could you then almost say you feel an empathy or at least an understanding as to why back then the best thing to do was cover all of this up? Because it seems there are so many moving parts. How do you come out then as the US government? Let's use that umbrella term, but I think many folks listening and watching this know by now that the US government is offices and buildings and people and groups, and, you know, it doesn't work as one well-oiled machine. It's very much, it's the Bible. It's lots of books that make up one thing, and we're going to get to the whole religious aspect in a bit. But yeah, the idea that the best thing to do is just cover this up, because you can't come out and say, look, we've recovered a craft it's alien technology coming from somewhere else. We're not too sure at this moment, but we're not alone. But also, there's lots of Russian stuff going on. We're being spied on. We've got advanced technology from the Nazis. By the way, we've brought some of those guys over. We're working on it too. So some of the craft you might see might be aliens, but they also might be ours or Russian. How would that even work? You can see why they went all of it in a room, close the door.
Yeah, I do get that. I do. I totally empathize with the panic. And I think especially for Truman, I don't think Truman would have had access to everything, because you got to remember Truman was, I think, 10 years before he became president. And he was the guy who was really having to deal with this. But he was just working as a farmer. Like he was just a really normal person who somehow found his way into politics, moved up the ranks, and then FDR dies and he's just about to become VP, and now suddenly he's president, okay? He's a total outsider. The people who were controlling the intelligence apparatus during the war, the people who were basically controlling the government before the war, were these massive industrialists, Rockefeller, who were very close with the Dulleses and the Mellons, and these huge titans who basically could tell the government to do whatever they wanted. And they controlled the intelligence apparatus during the war. And so they absolutely were the ones who were controlling the full view of what was going on with this phenomenon. And I think with the people controlling this little these Nazi enclaves that existed in all sorts of different places, potentially building the advanced tech, those people were really running the country. Truman comes in. By the way, Truman had accused the Rockefellers of treason during the war because of their shady dealings. But he again, I think like FDR before him, is relatively powerless, as are many of the presidents afterwards, to really deal with this huge sprawling situation. And, because some of it's privatized, even by then, I think some of it's in sort of quasi-private hands. It's not so easy to control. So I sympathize with him and with the other people. And I think the real enemy here is actually, even at this point, probably not even the government, but is this kind of quasi-private industrial complex emerging around it. The military-industrial complex is what Eisenhower called it, but it had really emerged, I think, before the war as well. So it's a bigger thing than just the government.
It seems we've got the approach then, secrecy first, investigation second. And you say, do you think we're starting to see then the seeds from the late 40s into the 50s of the divisions between people who see this as an exotic technology, but then are you also seeing groups of folks who are looking, going, this is more than that. This is something stranger. This is esoteric. Are we seeing the religious aspect come in yet? Are we seeing demonic interpretation come in yet, even in those early days, do you think?
Yes, we are. And I think even in those early days, there are some religious components, I think, who want to spread that idea to lock the issue down. They don't necessarily believe it's that black and white. And I think there are some people who are just Bible-believing Christians who just view it that way, in the same way I did when I was 19, right? Where I was just like, it all makes sense, it all fits together. But, the story Nick Redfern tells is that pretty much as soon as Roswell happened, there was an investigation going on in the Air Force. Well, was it in the Air Force initially? There was a small project looking into Jack Parsons, looking into this occult correlation, because for those who aren't aware, Jack Parsons was doing some interesting stuff in the desert, these occult rituals with L. Ron Hubbard, the guy who founded Scientology. Jack Parsons, of course, was real pioneer in terms of rocketry. During the war, he'd developed this jet-assisted takeoff technology, which was really a huge breakthrough for the US. He also was fascinated with the occult and was a student of Aleister Crowley, doing all these rituals in the desert, and then the UFO phenomenon appears. At least that's the way it's depicted in this Collins Elite book by Nick Redfern. But, the issue is the rituals in the desert happened in 1946. The wave happened in 1947. So I don't know that there's... a lot of people say space and time doesn't matter when it comes to this stuff. But frankly, if that's the case, then I can claim anything is correlated to anything. So I actually think the argument put forward in Redfern's book about where this all began is a little bit dubious. But just before I go deep, the fundamental background here, the claim is Redfern met with people from the Air Force who claimed to be part of something called the Collins Elite, which is this group which they claim started in the late 40s, pretty much as soon as the UFO phenomenon began to appear. They claim they began to see all of these occult correlations. And so this other program was set up. This is another part of the onion, which is now looking at the occult correlations. Through the book, the claim is the occult correlations were absolutely there and that these things are biblical demons. And that's what that group began to believe. And then there's a load of stuff further on as you go in, but that's the basic idea. So that was already happening in the 40s.
A lot of the occult stuff, the Aleister Crowley stuff, I don't know much about at all. And I know a lot of folks begin to put those pieces into the puzzle and why things are perhaps even the way they are now. Dan Zetterstrom, I know you were just on with him on his show, knows a lot about that kind of stuff. He's done loads of kind of looking into it, and he's a really good kind of source on that side of the phenomenon. I just, through multiple reasons, never really looked into that too much yet. But it's something that I know a lot of folks kind of subscribe to. And you're mentioning the Collins Elite, going back to them, we're saying as early as the 40s. Are we getting into the Collins Elite stuff yet, or is there still room for discussing the 60s and whatnot first?
Well, I mean, the Collins Elite definitely are emerging then in terms of what Redfern's accounts, and it depends in the 60s. You know, I wouldn't say the 60s is an area that it depends what your question is. What do you think's going on in the 60s? Where do you want to go?
Well, the conversation changes from the 40s seem very focused on. We had Roswell. Obviously now we know Magenta may or may not have happened. Some folks would dispute that. Graham Rendell, who you mentioned, author and historian, doesn't completely subscribe unless anything's changed to Magenta being a legitimate case for multiple different reasons and issues with memos and such. People can go back and listen to those conversations I've had. Jason, I would recommend reaching out to Graham to get even into that kind of conversation with him, because he's really knowledgeable. But the 60s, we have then like the abduction phenomenon becomes a thing, contactee stories, high strangeness reports, psychic elements. We know the 60s are a time of experimentation, the drug culture, psychedelics become widely used in the United States, in the UK. So does that just go hand in hand? Is this that evolution of the topic? Or again, is it something that's used to spread disinformation, misinformation, or muddy the waters of UFOs?
Yeah, I think with the abduction phenomenon, it's kind of unbelievable, isn't it? It's just what began to happen for a period of time. And it seems, I'm not an expert on like studying every case out there. That's not really what I do. But it seems as though abductions began around that time and they ended, sort of slowed down again. And so there's this period where you've got abductions happening. Why? And I think that one of the going theories in the CIA seems to have been that there was some kind of genetic program going on, that the phenomenon has an interest in our genetics, maybe trying to change it or do something or preserve some of it or exploit it for its own purposes. It's not clear. But that's certainly interesting. And I find it, one thing I do really find interesting is, if you go to the valet control system hypothesis thing, so that would mean that the phenomenon's existed for a long, long time, but now its behavior is changing. As soon as we begin to become more aggressive and destabilized, suddenly we're being abducted and there's all this genetic stuff going on. Why? What is it? Is it trying to preserve like important genetic material so that if we wipe ourselves out, it can seed the planet again? Why is it suddenly now that we're seeing this? And I don't know what the answer is, but I do find that to be a disturbing, scary component to this.
For me, what would make the most sense, and I'm not saying this is definitely it, I've got a very fluid opinion across this whole topic, and I think that's a healthy way for me at least to view things. If this phenomenon really ramped up in the 40s with Roswell and our use of atomic weapons, nuclear energy, then going through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the various flaps we had, different things maybe coming here, different things materializing here. You've got your attention on us. it would seem there would be phases of an operation of sorts. I'm not saying in that necessarily in a military way, but was there a period of observation and study? Because that would make sense to me. And popular theory is abductions have slowed down, if not stopped. There are still people who say they're abducted. Social media make these kind of claims a lot more frequent and almost harder to comprehend, because for so long we had the same cases, didn't we? I think if you name the famous abduction cases, you would still say Betty and Barney Hill, Calvin Parker,
Mm.
Whitley Strieber, Travis Walton, but then they're from a time period, they're from a couple of decades, and then things seem to have slowed or been less reported. And it just makes sense to me that perhaps whatever was happening, the box was ticked. We've learned enough about these. We know their genetics. We know their biology. We've read their code, like you say, our DNA. We know if I was a species like that, how do they get pregnant? How does reproduction work in general? What's the food system? Same with cattle mutilations. If you're studying a food chain, cattle would be one place you would go to almost immediately. We know what they eat. We know how that works. So if you wanted to start changing things, messing with genetics, changing the evolutionary, path of a species, you could do that. But if you just wanted to learn a lot about them, you would take some samples, study them, and then go, cool, we know what we need to know, so we can stop that now.
Mm.
To what
Mm.
ends, I'm not entirely sure. You can then go down the threat narrative of something's on its way or something's here, that something's planning an attack. But I don't know, because and this was something you touched on earlier, this idea of like an apocalyptic event, something happening, when you mentioned right at the beginning with, the Bible and religious kind of texts say that there's going to be an end time, or people interpret that in different ways. Is it Armageddon means beginning? I can't remember. It's not necessarily the end of something, depending on how folks interpret it. So is it a case that World War One, if we had social media, let me put it this way, because I'm blabbering. If we had social media in World War One and the UFO topic was popular, people would have went, this is the end times. But it wasn't, and we lurched forward to World War Two. People would have went, good God, this is the end times coming now. Nuclear weapons dropped and used on people.
Yeah.
This is the end times. Something's going to step in. Nope, we come out of World War Two. We then go to the Cold War. Cuban Missile Crisis. We're so close to midnight on that doomsday clock. Nope, we come out of that, and then any number of conflicts and wars, nuclear tests that have happened since. All this idea we're building to some sort of end days event,
Mm.
we keep going from one potential climax to another, and we just keep repeating the cycle, and we don't have the aliens or the NHI or the control system making an impact on a grand scale that we see. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to recognize. I think one of the biggest things that we as a sort of disclosure movement, or whatever this is, have to be really aware of is apocalyptic eschatological urgency is a very powerful tool in terms of how it changes behavior. Like, when I first became a Christian, I was so convinced that the end was coming. I was like, I'm not going to put any money in my pension. I'm not going to do a whole bunch of things. I'm not going to bother saving, because I was convinced the end was coming, right? I was obviously wrong. But it's interesting how this perception that something is coming, Trump's going to announce something, something's going to come in 2027. The Antichrist is coming, according to Peter Thiel. All of these things create a context where there's not much time left. And so, and also a context where everything's going to be revealed anyway. So I've got less time, and all of these things are just going to happen. So you become very passive. You stop investigating. You're waiting. According to this guy on X, he says, Trump's going to make his announcement in the next few days or whatever. And so it sort of creates this environment where everyone's always anticipating something coming, and it changes the way you behave. And the best analogy I like to use is, if I tell you dinner is going to be ready in 10 minutes, the odds of you going to the fridge drops dramatically. Whereas if I tell you like dinner's going to be 4 hours, I'm like, I'm going to go eat now because I'm really hungry. These time constraints do affect us massively. And also in a grander, larger geopolitical sense, they absolutely short circuit our ability to make sensible long-term decisions. And I think we're seeing that in general. There's this urgency this sense that, things aren't going to last very long, that, economically, that disaster's looming, war is looming. And so the younger generation now are changing the way that they behave, quite rightly, because they view themselves as existing in an apocalyptic generation. I think we should be very conscious of the fact that that might be intentional, whether it's coming from groups out there that want to manipulate the future of human evolution, whether they're human groups or non-human groups. I don't know. It might not be happening, but I would be very wary of anyone who tells you that something's going to happen soon. I would behave as though it's not going to.
Yeah, what I was thinking, or what I was confusing, was the word apocalyptic. So that refers to total catastrophic destruction or end of the world, but it comes from the Greek root apocalypsis, meaning an unveiling or revelation. So when someone says an apocalyptic event, yes, they might mean the world will literally blow up and explode, but it could also very much mean we're in for a new beginning, a revelation, we're going to find aliens are real, something like that. So like you say, people use these terms, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, in the wrong way. But that doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. But you're quite right that people use these things and put timestamps on it. And I'm always very wary in the UFO topic of anything being given a timeline, because I can't imagine aliens having their 12-month calendar in their spaceship going, is it July 8th yet? No, not yet. Cool. Yeah, let's just hang fire on the backside of the moon next to this monolith that's been talked about in the news. Let's just wait because we're not due till tomorrow.
Yeah.
And even then, right, July 8th, are they going, that's UK time, Australia time? Because the Aussies will pass, and are we waiting on the US catching up? Is it Eastern? Is it Pacific?
Yeah.
I really struggle with the calendar aspect of things. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So especially, and that's where, if the Bledsoes predict, something happening in Easter, and then change to Halloween, the calendar stuff really gets to me. I'd love to know your take on those kind of predictions.
Yeah, well, thinking about the Bledsoes, I think it's a really good example of where you need to give credit to the fact that they clearly had an experience, but also recognize that if they did have this profound experience, and if all of those intelligence people did arrive in their house, which it seems they did, then everything that happens after that is up for debate. I really think it's worth recognizing. A lot of people like to throw shade on them and to say, like, Ryan's doing this, or I don't believe this, and I totally get it. But the thing is, they clearly had an experience, and they clearly have been completely overwhelmed by various intelligence factions who probably overwhelmingly just want to destabilize them and prevent them from threatening how they control the narrative. If they're having direct contact in a powerful way with a non-human intelligence, and they're making these prophecies and people are paying attention, that could be a huge threat to everything that the defense intelligence establishment is trying to achieve in terms of how it messages this. So I think, in the case of them and their predictions, I personally would wonder how much of what happened later could have been experiences generated, designed to steer them away from the original access they had, to drive them towards making false predictions, to sort of discredit them slowly so that they stop being this bypass mechanism. Because right now, we're always thinking, when's the government going to tell me, right? So that everyone's consciousness is projected towards the government, waiting for them to please feed us. When these powerful experiences happen and they get attention, they bypass that, because now we've got direct access to the phenomenon. And if the phenomenon really is trying to communicate something, it bypasses this control the government has. So just, do not doubt the idea that certain people may want to destabilize these people who do get access. So I'm just very wary of anyone who makes a prediction like that. And I don't think it's coming from a bad place with Chris and Ryan. I feel so bad for them, because they're just getting swung at from all angles, from probably non-human and human intelligence, just confusing the situation. So yeah, I don't put too much stock in it anymore. I did a while ago. I was kind of overwhelmed by all the predictions. I was like, wow, this is really feel. Now I'm just a lot more skeptical, and I just try and live my life as if we'll continue at the pace we are, which will lead to something eventually. But I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah. Well, let's move into the 1970s then. So President Carter is a name that is synonymous with the UFO topic, and I wonder, from your perspective, you've done a lot of research into this. How important is President Carter in the UFO timeline and being in charge of the topic for some time?
Yeah, Carter's interesting. And, Jesse Michaels had that interview with, I think it was Eric Davis, where they confirmed that there was a sort of a briefing for Carter. He'd
Hmm.
obviously seen a UFO as well. And so I find him interesting, but he's got two forces lingering over him, which lead him, I think, to be easily controlled. One is pretty much the entire Carter administration was stuffed with people from the Trilateral Commission, which is, one of these Rockefeller bodies. And look, I don't want to just say like everything associated with the Rockefellers is bad, but I think they're part of very central to the group of people who actually had control over this for a long time. So the fact that he had those people in his administration, I think, is one thing. He'll be surrounded with people who are very cautious. And then also there was Alonzo McDonald, who was a very evangelical Christian. He was the staff director for Carter. And it's interesting because in Vallet's journals, volume 6, he presented Alonzo McDonald as maybe being part of the Collins elite. In fact, that's very much the implication from the journals. In his most recent journals, he's kind of nuanced that by saying he was definitely like a religious person who believed in a lot of this stuff, but the Collins elite was even deeper than he was, and that he was kind of shocked by what he was seeing. So McDonald's kind of in the group, but kind of outside of it. Anyway, it sort of introduces this evangelical Christian thing, because not only was Jimmy Carter deep in with the Trilateral Commission and the Rockefeller sort of world, he was also a very Christian person. And so I think for him, it would have been very easy to have bought into the idea that this was demonic or represented some big spiritual threat. And so I don't know that you could say Carter was part of the Collins elite. I don't think it works like that. But I do think that their ideas, combined with probably Rockefeller pressure for secrecy, would have led him to just keep a lid on things,
Yeah.
I certainly do think that that's the sensible trajectory to view it in. Yeah.
So I think we're past the point of spoilers being too much of an issue, folks, but I'm going to bring up something from the movie Disclosure Day at the moment. So if you're really still that sensitive, maybe skip a couple of minutes, but not too much. In Disclosure Day, there's a scene where we see security camera footage, and it's meant to be obviously recreated, folks. I'm not saying it was real footage by any means before anyone misconstrues that. Jimmy Carter showing is Jackie Gleason, the actor of the time, or the big celebrity, who was into the UFO topic, and allegedly Carter took Gleason to a facility and shows him the body. And you see on the CCTV footage, have you seen
Oh
Disclosure
yeah.
Day?
Yeah, I have. It's actually Nixon you're thinking of.
Nixon, sorry, yeah, Nixon,
yeah,
sorry, because I wanted to bring this up. Nixon's before Carter, isn't he? After, before,
up before. Yeah.
before, yeah. That, I knew I'd missed that off. And you see Nixon take Jackie Gleason in. What's your take on this idea of presidents having that sort of access, that potentially, if that happened, that he literally took a celebrity, Nixon, took Gleason in, opens the vault and goes, "Look at this. You see the alien body lying there." And then this is something that then the national security state, I imagine your intel agencies, your military officers are horrified when they
Yeah.
hear this may have happened.
Yeah.
And that changes things, surely.
Yeah, I don't believe it. I don't. I think it's a really interesting story, and I think let's add to the context here. Nixon did make very early connections with Alan Dulles, and so I think from a very early period before, many years before he became president, he was working with the deep states in
Hmm.
executing their agenda. So I do think Nixon would have been one of the people who would have been in the trusted inner circle when it came to this topic. But the story here is that Nixon was drunk one night, went to go get his best friend, who has a national voice, and takes him. I don't think I think by the time Nixon comes in, Kennedy's been assassinated, right?
Hmm.
I don't think that the let's just call them the deep state. It's a rubbish term, but let's just call. I don't think they're going to allow a sitting president to come in drunk with a celebrity and look at alien bodies. I think the security protocols will be so rigid as to make that impossible. Now, I could be completely wrong, but it doesn't make any sense to me. But the story's wonderful. And of course, Jackie Gleason was fascinated by UFOs. His wife did say that it happened, and he did end up building a flying saucer shaped house. So there's like the aftermath. It's like, okay, well, there's a story there, but it strikes me as kind of unbelievable that Nixon could have bypassed. It would have been very different, by the way, if like Alan Dulles was president, or if, I don't know, like Nelson Rockefeller or someone like that. I think I can imagine they could have just they could have drawn the lines and said what they wanted. But I don't think Nixon was a true elite establishment figure in that sense. I think he was an outsider who was brought in. And so I just can't imagine that he would have been allowed to do it.
Do you think around this time, between these different presidencies, obviously they've had issues with Kennedy, which we know how that ends up. Hand on heart, folks, I believe Kennedy was assassinated, shot for her, and not by Lee Harvey Oswald, the way people think. Obviously, I'd go with the CIA, the intel agency's done that. But you've now had presidents almost be put back in their place by these agencies. Is this where we see a real shift in the balance of power, of who's in charge, who's running these cover-ups, that it's not the guy signing the papers on the desk, and that is just a front person for a lot of this?
Absolutely. 100%. And again, I think this goes back to before World War II, where the balance of power lies. It's 1933. Roosevelt writes to his friend, I forget his name, I think his name's Stone or something, and he says, you and I both know that the real power has lied with financial interests since the days of Andrew Jackson. And this is where, as UFO conspiracy people, we may not want that label, but let's just call ourselves this. We have so much information to sift through that unfortunately we rarely look at the broader set of like geopolitical realities. The truth is, we want to point the finger at Glenn Gaffney, and I get it. And it is Glenn Gaffney, isn't it, the guy at the CIA who's...
That's who Knapp mentioned in the hearing, yeah.
Yeah. We want to point the finger at these gatekeepers, and I totally get it, right? They're not helping. I think that the poison goes back hundreds of years to just general industrial control of the government, which is what FDR was referring to 100 years ago. And so by the time you get to Kennedy and he's assassinated for not playing ball, I don't think, I mean, obviously it's a huge moment, and it's very symbolic, but I think the balance of power has been out of place for a long time prior to that. So, again, to come back to World War II, who was running the intelligence agencies who had access to this? In the United States, you had Wild Bill Donovan, who was a Wall Street lawyer, working with the Mellons and with the Dulleses, who were some of the richest establishment people in the world. There was also another American intelligence agency called the Office for the Coordination of Inter-American Affairs, which managed South America. Very important intelligence agency if you want to monitor whether the Nazis are exfiltrating to South America. Who was the best person to run that? Apparently it was Nelson Rockefeller. Over in the United Kingdom, the person running the Special Operation Executive is a guy called Charles Hambro. He's the director of the Bank of England. The people running the intelligence establishment in the critical years were the people who owned the industry and financial networks. And so by the time we get to Kennedy and we see this outrageous action, it's already too late. So I really think that we have to grapple with the fact that we're not just dealing with a secrecy issue to do with UFOs. We're dealing with, and I don't want to get political here, but we are dealing with an economic issue about who controls the very fundamental components of industry, of finance, and therefore also controls the government. It is all part of a bigger story here where control has been coming down vertically for a long, long time. And so it's not going to be enough to get declassification. We probably have to challenge the very way that power works. And I think that's a big thing that we probably need to talk about more. Sorry, big rant, but I think it's important.
No, 100%. And what I'm going to do is bring back in that Collins Elite chat, because this is a huge feature you've been working on your YouTube channel recently. 3-part series, is that correct?
3-part series. Yeah, there was a 4th bonus part live on the channel as well. So
okay, I've not caught up with that one yet. So what we're going to do is, you've mentioned the Collins Elite a few times. If you're on audio platforms and you're on the free feeds, you'll hear the end of part 1 here, and we'll get into part 2 in a couple of minutes. And you'll hear that in the next couple of days. On YouTube, you'll see the full thing. And if you're on the paid feeds, you'll hear the full audio for you to do what you want when you want. But listen, if you're sticking around, you're going to hear Jason now go into the Collins Elite. Jason, we're still here. There's been seconds have passed. Collins Elite is a popular phrase. Now, you've talked about them here going back well into the 40s and, even beforehand, but it's become popular again. Is this largely because of where we are with the topic, do you think, at the moment, with Congress digging into this, with talks of factions within the government controlling things? Is that why the Collins Elite as an idea has become more prevalent in conversation?
Yeah, I think there are many reasons why it's prevalent. I think obviously if there's a push for disclosure, which there clearly has been, there's going to be certain people resisting it. Some of those people are going to be sort of industrial people, private people, but some of them are going to be religious. And the Collins Elites therefore come up as a name used to describe this religious resistance. And sometimes that name is used to, I think, just generally throw onto someone who is being resistant for religious reasons. So it's sort of a bit of an amorphous term. But there's another point to this as well, which is even as we resist their resistance, as we push forwards in disclosure, there is then the question of how do we frame what's going on? And so if you're the Collins Elite, if such a group exists, which I'm pretty sure it does, and you're failing to stop disclosure, then you've got your backup plan, which is, okay, well, then I'm at least going to frame how disclosure works so that everyone thinks about it in religious terms. And I think that is a very important thing to... I actually was very worried about that. I'm less worried about it now, but I still think we're only entitled to be less worried about it if we're constantly aware that falling into the trap of explaining everything as being demonic is going to lead to really, really bad outcomes for us. So there are many reasons why I think it's becoming more important, but mostly because we're pushing for disclosure.
So let's start at the beginning then. What is the Collins Elite? Because like you say, is it a term? Is it a group? I think quite often when I hear something like the Collins Elite or the radical Christians in the US government, I imagine that they have a meeting room. It says on the door, Collins Elite. There's a big table with X number of seats. And they come and they sit and have a chat and go, cool, so this is the July meeting of the Collins Elite. What's going on just now? That's probably not the case. So can you kind of bring us up to speed?
Yeah, to be honest, if they had a formalized structure like that, I think it'd be quite interesting. I suspect, given what they're doing and the influence they have, it's probably covert. Although they obviously do have to meet still. The interesting thing about the Collins Elite, because everyone whispered about it here and there in different interviews and stuff, and I'm sure other people are similar to me, I became immensely curious about what is this. I still remember the first interview where I heard it, and I didn't even know what was said. So I wrote in the chat underneath the YouTube video, I was like, does anybody know what? And I completely misspelled it. And they were like, oh, you mean the Collins Elite? And that's the first time I actually saw the spelling. I was like, wow, what a strange name. Sounds so mysterious. So then I did what I think most people have done next, which is I bought the book. There's a book by Nick Redfern called Final Events, where, as I mentioned earlier, he claims that he came across these people in the Air Force who believed the UFO phenomenon was fundamentally demonic. And so he got in contact with them and they were willing to speak with him. And they told him the whole history. So there was a guy called Robert Manners, Mr. Manza. I forget all the names, but they had a variety of sort of cover names. We didn't get the real names. And these people told him, oh yeah, Richard Duke was one of them. These people told him that going back to the 40s, when the UFO phenomenon had first appeared, there was concern that it was actually some sort of occult demonic phenomenon, that it wasn't necessarily extraterrestrial. And they claimed that all of these correlations were popping up, including the fact that Jack Parsons was doing these rituals in the desert, but also other things like when there was that wave in 1952, they claimed Jack Parsons had died having done some magical experiment which had led to this explosion and he died. And then like a few weeks later, the UFO phenomenon appears over DC. So they were claiming there's these correlations. I think the correlations are frankly nonsense. Like I mentioned earlier that the ceremony that Parsons did was in 1946. The UFO phenomenon is all over America in 1947. It's a year later, and it's spread geographically beyond where the thing happened. So, I just think, come on, we can't pin everything on that. But not only that, a lot of the other correlations they talk about where they're like, look, there was a group of Parsons devotees in this particular area, and then the UFO phenomenon happens 100 miles away. And it's like, really? 100 miles? So there's lots of stuff like this. But the truth is, this is what I find really interesting about this. The case built in the book, I think, is pretty weak. But the truth is, there does seem to be a huge correlation with the occult. And some great examples would be the whole psionics thing, or even to use Stephen Greer as an example with the CE5 thing. Like, yeah, there's significant questions about what's really going on there now, but there's always been this idea that if you tune into a certain level of your consciousness, certain barriers break down and you might get access to things. And it's just thinking about Jesse Michaels talking about, he did some holotropic breath work, and that's when he saw one of the UFOs that he's seen. So I think we should be very open to the idea that a change in the state of consciousness may make these things appear, or rather may remove the barriers by which we normally don't see them. And so I do think there's a correlation, but the way it's explained in the book is a little bit silly. Anyway, just to
Do you know what that reminds me of, Jason? It's
yeah.
a little bit, they've been able to access things that you shouldn't be able to. Sometimes I hit the wrong combination of keys on my MacBook and it brings up code on the right-hand side, like back office stuff. And I go, oh, I don't know what that is, what it means, but I know it's to do with running this MacBook. I want rid of that because I shouldn't be seeing that. That is not for me. And that's what I kind of think of for that kind of stuff, where I'm like, oh, now and again, you get to see the administrative side of the computer, and that is not for me. I just want to see the user interface. I want to see the basic stuff that I can point and click and type, and everything else is kind of not for me.
I love that. It's like the secret code under reality that I never realize is there, and suddenly it appears. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is actually being run in a completely different way. Yeah, it's just exactly like that. So it seems that's advocated by very sensible people, and so I'm open to that. Anyway, the Collins elite then present this theory, and the whole idea is that the occult correlation is coming because people have summoned evil entities into the world. And there's this claim that Jack Parsons was born on the day that this Christian person claimed was the day that the end times would begin. And so it's like that he was the Antichrist who was born on this day. But the prediction made by that group of Christians was complete nonsense. So it's like, why are we putting validation on that? But the whole idea is that the end times are now here. Parsons appears, he summons these entities, and they've broken through into our reality. And that this is the deceptive end times thing, because Satan and his hordes are playing one final trick on humanity. And the trick is this: we're going to masquerade as an extraterrestrial intelligence. We're going to come and tell you that all of your religions were wrong. Christianity wasn't quite right. Here's how the universe really works. And they're going to trick us into believing that, like, sort of antichrist belief system. And so, it sort of then integrates with the biblical view of the end times. And so that's the whole idea of the Collins elite. And to be very clear here, right, what Redfern is describing sounds like a special access program before that terminology was used. And the reason I say that is because it came from the Directorate of Planning, I think it's what it's called, the same directorate where things like Operation Mockingbird, MK Ultra, Operation Gladio were funded from, which these are extraordinarily sensitive operations. And so the way it's set up, it sounds like a very sensitive operation that's getting black budget funding to study this. So you've got this program that's set up from the Air Force and is running. But here's where the Collins elite gets confusing, okay? Because you've also got all of these evangelical Christians who are in government and in the Defense Department, who people say they're the Collins elite. But a lot of these people, frankly, would have no business being part of this highly sensitive special access program, looking into like occult technology and all of this stuff. And it doesn't make sense that all of these people are part of that. It's not how these programs work. And so in my research, I looked into the Family Network. Valet had given some hints about this. The Family Network is this big evangelical network that exists across government and in the DoD, even in the White House, in Congress, in the Senate. They've had people in this network now for about 100 years who basically act. The original vision was to create an invisible mafia, that was the terminology used, across government, effectively giving this organization the ability to push its own agenda in a big way that's somewhat invisible. So it's a little bit deceptive. They view it as, we're Christians, we need to make sure God's will is being executed. People associated with the family include James Baker, who is the chief of staff for Ronald Reagan, and Alonzo McDonald, who's the chief of staff or staff director for Carter. Both of those presidents got UFO briefings. Both of those people knew about those briefings. In fact, James Baker, according to Redfern, sat in on a Reagan briefing on UFOs where he was exposed to the Collins elite theories, which they really liked. The reason I point this out is to show the Collins elite ideas very likely got infused into this family network. And so you've got a sensitive government program and an informal non-government network intersecting and becoming kind of one thing. And so the spread of this theory and the spread of these Christians spreading these ideas grows through the family network is what it looks like. But there's another component as well as a third factor, because Vallée and his colleagues suggest that the Collins elite may have emerged from Fordham University. This is where it gets really confusing because the family network starts in 1930. The Collins elite program in the Air Force starts in the late 40s. The Fordham University strand starts in the 60s and 70s, according to Vallée. So it's a little bit confusing. But here's what I think is going on. Fordham University is a very high establishment university, but it's also a Catholic university. And Catholicism also has a stake here. The Catholic Church has always resisted every single revolution that's come its way. Scientific revolutions, people were put to death or locked up. Philosophical revolutions, theological revolutions, like the Protestants coming out. They literally fought wars to try and stop this other theological movement. And then, of course, you have the political revolutions in the 1800s with Napoleon and the French and American revolutions. The Vatican was opposed to those because it threatened their traditional model of power. It's so important to recognize the Catholic Church will always resist change. The biggest revolution that they've always been facing has been non-human experiences that challenge the theology that they're built on. That's why if you go through history, you look at, for example, Fatima. When Fatima occurred, the Catholic Church immediately reinterpreted what people claimed was a silvery disc in the sky became the sun. So they changed this tantalizing situation into something more manageable. If you look at the Witches' Sabbat, which is where these people were getting effectively abducted by what they thought were witches and having these experiments done. It was an early abduction phenomenon, essentially. They were told anyone who's involved in that is demonic, and they were basically put to death. And, there's so many examples here where any time a non-human experience challenges the Vatican's message, it gets constrained and reformatted. So when it comes to the 20th century, the UFO wave is growing. What is the Vatican going to do? Are they going to acknowledge this and deal with it openly? Or is it more advantageous for them to spread this demonic hypothesis and to try and prevent people from engaging with it, saying, too dangerous, we can't study this, we must ensure that no one else looks at it either? And the kicker for me is this. The person who is running the Air Force Office of Special Investigations in the era when it started the original Collins Elite programs, this is the 40s, the one that Redfern refers to, was a devout Roman Catholic who actually had really wanted to go into the ministry, but was encouraged by some powerful people to not go into the ministry, but instead go into intelligence. And so this is an individual who fundamentally, first and foremost, answers to the Pope, answers to religious groups, rather than the Air Force or the president. That's really what's going on here. I think his name was General Francis Carroll. I don't think it's out of the question that when this whole Collins Elite project might have started or something like that in the Air Force, the Catholic Church would have found out about it and they would have thought, yeah, actually, we're going to spread this theory because this is beneficial to us. We would rather people believe that it's all demonic, that it's not as complicated as it really is. And so I'm putting pieces together here, but on balance, all of these groups have the same motivation, which is silence the UFO discussion because it threatens the models that their theology is built on. And there's another component here where we can talk about the deep state, which I think is also important. So one of the biggest things that I became very aware of was all of these so-called devout Christians who were, talking about the need to maintain the Christian identity of the nation and were the sorts of people connected to the groups who were disseminating these ideas. They were also deeply involved in the deep state. Many of them were involved in Iran-Contra. Many of them, like one of them, Charles Colson, who ended up going to prison for Watergate. He's a real criminal who was spreading some of these ideas. So when it comes to looking at these people who claim to be deeply concerned about the Bible and making sure God's word is fulfilled, these are the same people running some of the deepest, darkest scandals associated with our government. And in my final piece in the Collins Elite, I made a point of saying they look less like a group of Bible-believing Christians and more like a group of deep state thugs. And I do think that I would love to ask some of the people who really know about this how they view it. Do they view the Collins Elite as just religious people trying to do their best? Or for them, is it this weird deep state hybrid that's leveraging religion as a weapon to try and fulfill its own objectives? And, I've begun to see it more as the second part.
It's really interesting. I appreciate the kind of depth you've went into there. Like, one of the first things that jumps out to me is if you have this group, which, and I know you're trying to differentiate there, that it's not necessarily a group of, Bible loving extremist Christians. It's more deep state, more intelligence. But is it a closed off group that you need that religious background to do it? Again, could a Muslim or a Sikh or is it very much a closed group? And if that's then the case, would it not make sense that other religious groups would have something similar themselves? Is that anything you've came across?
Yeah. A lot of folks have reached out to me by email or in the comments saying, you need to look into the Islamic side of this. And, I certainly would expect that every religion is going to have its own stance on the phenomenon. And for those religions that have very rigid theology, any sort of non-human contact can undermine that by, giving people sort of direct access to information rather than through a book. So I would suspect there's a general reticence on religious groups to be open to non-human encounters. People may say I'm wrong about that. I've not researched every religion in depth on this.
Shame on you.
Yeah, I know. It's not good. We'll
full time now, Jason. Come on, you need to up your game. It's like
I'm going to turn it up. Yeah, I'm going to read all the scriptures as soon as I can. But I do think that in general, is there a formalized group? No, I think it's this sort of weird network, and I'll give you a great example of where the network is particularly sort of loose. I think it's in the Reagan administration, where you've got the Reagan administration receives a briefing from Collins Elite figures from the program. It also has many people in high-ranking positions from the family, and also has lots of very senior, like Knights of Malta Catholic people, all intersecting with some different views, and then just loads of deep state people. So like sort of Rockefeller establishment type people. And the thing is, I think they all just interlock and support each other because they have very similar objectives. I think that the reason that these religious groups would have ended up, I don't want to say the religious groups were involved in like Iran-Contra, but people from those groups end up in Iran-Contra, Watergate, these scandals, is because they're willing to go along with the deep state line. And because they're the way that they think, their very conservative mentality completely suits the existing establishment's mentality. So yeah, only some of them are religious, but ultimately it's all, they have the same trajectory and philosophy and mindset as the rest of the sort of deep state. So I think they kind of fuse into it quite nicely.
We'll perhaps touch on them again. Well, we will touch on them again throughout this as we get up to more modern times. But during part one, we were speaking through the 40s to the 70s, 80s and 90s. UFO conversation changes again, and we touched on abductions. And like you say, there were earlier examples of abductions, but it becomes a major part of the subject. Hybrids is one that you wanted to bring up, and when we were speaking beforehand around this conversation, I want to know your take on, because what we seem to have got through those decades now is ETs, flying saucers, perhaps some element of psychedelics or psychosis control. You mentioned MK Ultra. We're now at a point in the 80s and 90s where even the public are quite aware of alien abductions, the idea of hybrids. We've had multiple TV shows and movies, kind of showcasing that idea at that point. What about that narrative with the idea of demons coming into this, and these beings are dangerous, they're not just coming from other planets? What's kind of happening around that time scale?
Do you mean specifically in the 90s or
80s, 90s, that just general time, I think. And I suppose a big aspect of that is TV shows and movies have had a lot of exposure now to the UFO topic at that point.
Yeah. I a while ago I was doing an interview with someone and they were like, what's your favorite fictional depiction of the phenomenon and why? And I was so embarrassed that I couldn't even think of one because I just don't really watch that much sort of movies or TV stuff. I'm just, always geeking out on like weird things. So on that side I'm less strong, but I think, to come back to the Reagan administration on the kind of the fear and the sense that something bad might be happening, there's this interesting thing that happens in the 80s, which is, on the one hand, you have the emergence of the Satanic Panic, which I've always found fascinating, this huge surge in this kind of Christian culture saying, this music's demonic. These demonic entities are trying to get in. Don't let your children, like later on, they would be like, don't let your children watch Pokemon. It's like black magic. This whole culture of like fear about anything which could be associated with the occult and the implications it could have. And I've always been fascinated with that, of course, as someone who was Christian, as someone who's interested in these topics. But now, studying the Collins elite and looking at this trajectory, I look at that and I think, what a perfect fever to create if you are someone who believes that this is demonic and you do believe the occult may create more of these phenomenon and you want to control that. Well, I don't want to have to build a system into people's lives, but what if I spread fear through the culture by creating this satanic panic and making people terrified of engaging with the occult? So I find that very interesting in the 80s. And simultaneously, whilst you've got this kind of, how do we create fear on the planet? Up in space, simultaneously, Reagan is building, well, Reagan's not like flying up there, constructing it like a dad building a shed. But, he's funneling huge amounts of money into industry to build the Star Wars system, the Strategic Defense Initiative, this fast, space-based defense system, ostensibly to try and create sort of a new strategy in which to engage in this nuclear arms race, to say, like, look, it's not just mutually assured destruction. Maybe we can actually build defenses. But so much testimony has come out over the years from people who have had access, suggesting that the real purpose of that program was to build a huge system to defend against the phenomenon. And that Tom DeLonge was very big on that when he was initially speaking with his advisors. Early interviews, again and again, he talks about how everyone came together and built this huge defense system, and that it actually worked and it was successful. So anyway, interesting whenever you think of DeLonge that people come out and say this. But then there's also, recently we've had this missing scientist thing, right? Well, if you go back to the Star Wars project, 22 scientists mysteriously died whilst this thing was being built. And I mean, in total, really confusing circumstances. And so it makes you wonder, like, if you're trying to defend against this phenomenon, does it bite back? Or does someone who's on the side of the phenomenon try and prevent you from doing it? Are they sending a warning? Because you're building up here this huge defense system, you're trying to deal with it down here. So I do think that the actual activities going on in the 80s do depict a sort of a grand surge in an attempt to push back. That's definitely the sense that I get. And then, of course, the Cold War ends and the whole atmosphere starts to shift. So, yeah.
Do you have any examples? You mentioned those 22 scientists, Jason, in mysterious ways that they died. Is there anything particular that stands out?
God, I forget. But it's not far from where I'm from here in Somerset. There was someone driving home in the early hours, like an hour away from here. And as they were doing it, they crashed in a way that didn't make any sense. It was like they crashed into a tree and the body was found in some way that was like really confusing. I can't remember the details, but it was, I remember just thinking, wow, that doesn't make any sense at all. I don't remember the other ones. I must confess, I've not looked into all 22. But
the old, self-inflicted multiple bullet wounds in the back of the head type thing and
all of that stuff. Yeah, very confusing. And I think also some of their behavior was confusing as well. Apparently they were, acting up in weird ways. But yeah, I don't know if Jesse Michaels mentioned it in his Missing Scientists, like he did a 90-minute deep dive on that. So it might be on there.
I'm still going to get to, obviously, DeLonge, the 2000s, TTSA. where for you does the hybrid program come into this conversation? That's something that's been popular recently, but the idea of hybrids, hybridizations, and kind of dangers around that.
Yeah, I became really interested in this because enough significant people were clearly highlighting that this was a real thing, but that it couldn't be spoken about. So 3 examples that came up that struck me. Number one was DeLonge. When DeLonge came out, he was talking about how he was talking with his advisors, and then he said, as soon as I asked a question about hybrids, they stopped responding, and I was made aware that this was not something I was supposed to be talking about yet. So it's just like not a permitted conversation. Then you had John Ramirez. When John Ramirez first came out, he said everyone's waiting for Elizondo to talk about hybrids, the fact that we're all hybrids, but he said it's not allowed to be talked about yet. There's a time constraint on that. And then in Valet's journals, there's a conversation he has with Diana Pasulka where he says they have told her not to talk about the hybrid issue yet. So you just have a lot of independent people here who are all connected to people in the know, indicating that this is a conversation that's yet to come. And I like to talk about Elizondo's 7-course meal analogy, which I think is very helpful. Also very helpful now because everyone's complaining. They're like, why have we got this scientific board? It's all so slow. And it's like, yeah, well, I'm sorry, but any government disclosure is going to go through an extraordinarily slow and laborious process. It just is.
Yeah. Bureaucracy is going to take over.
Exactly. They've got a messaging strategy. Organizations I've worked for, which have 400 employees, if we're going to communicate something to the organization that's sensitive, we meet up and talk about how we're going to do it. So now imagine the largest organization on earth dealing with the most sensitive issue ever, and it's going to communicate it to the entire population. Do you not think there's going to be a vast, really thoughtful communication strategy? Of course there's going to be.
And not just that, you would think, or at least hope, and again, we're speaking from the UK perspective here, that the US, this is not a US phenomenon. This is a worldwide phenomenon that they are going to have to, through back channels or whatever. And I always like to think that the people who really run things, not presidents and militaries, there are folks who have constant access via whatever methods to China, to Russia, to the US, the UK, and they literally pick up the phone and there's no geopolitical tensions. It's literally, look, we're going to disclose, blah, blah, blah. There needs to be some sort of larger communication base for this, surely. Not that the current United States administration wouldn't necessarily be the one to just come out and go, blah, and no, we've not consulted anyone else, to be fair.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. There'll be some kind of back channels going on to make sure everything's aligned. And, as part of that, then this 7-course meal analogy, I think, is really instructive because we can see what the courses have been. For those of us who've been just deep into this for a while, it was, wow, there's some inexplicable data out there. It seems to be objects. Whose could it be? Is it Russia or China? We don't think it's Russia or China or American. It's interesting. What could it be? And then it's like, could it be alien? Well, I don't know. That's one of the hypotheses. And then you get to some of them have crashed. Wow, interesting. Some of them have crashed and we collected them. And you keep moving along bit by bit. Now, it seems to me that somewhere ahead on this series of courses we're getting might be the hybrid conversation. But here's the issue. And I really think this is like such a good thought experiment. What happens when you talk about hybrids? Because the moment you begin to talk about UFOs and you talk about them being here and hybridization, then it raises questions. One of the questions might be, wait a second, how are we able to be hybridized with a non-human species unless we share some genetic material, unless we're related to them? Are we related to them? When did that start? Okay, so now I'm questioning our entire history and I'm questioning religion. But most importantly now I'm questioning everyone on the planet. How human and how non-human are you? What happens to human rights when some of us are partially non-human? What happens to the geopolitical conflicts and the racial war and the genocides and all of the insane stuff going on the planet when it turns out that there's now another layer on top of your mythologies, on top of your religions? There's now an objective genetic layer by which to differentiate people and potentially put them on a spectrum. And maybe people over that side of the world have a different type of non-human DNA because they've interacted with different non-humans, whereas we've got this. And maybe that thing I just told you is a mythology I'm telling you in the midst of all this confusion because I'm going to exploit this moment of confusion about what it means to be human, to fulfill my awful geopolitical agenda, to force you to go to war against a group of people who it turns out are not bad, but I'm going to accuse them of having genetic material that's connected to this awful thing. And this is why in Vallée's journals, and I'm not sure he's referring to this, but there's a moment in Forbidden Science Volume 6 where he says, we all agreed that disclosure would be dangerous and would just lead out of control, and that no one would be able to halt the trauma of maybe realizing that many of us on the planet are different. So I had in my notebook, I have like a Notion where I store all my notes and I keep track of everything I'm thinking about and learning. And I had this section on hybrids, and I was just dropping stuff in there. And I just thought, whatever. I'm not interested in the hybrid thing. It's kind of boring. And I came out the other end and I was just like, oh my goodness. I think this might be it might be one of the most shocking components of disclosure and it might be one of the reasons why it just probably we can't have access to all the information. And I would add a couple of extra details here. Firstly, you might be sitting there thinking, well, this sounds a bit far out, right? It's a lot of speculation. Firstly, don't forget that what happened in World War II, the genocides that happened then were based on a hierarchy of race. And there was a mythology then about different races and root races that had emerged and had led to these insane actions. So do not underestimate the power of the government coming out and validating that there's a racial hierarchy, which is not what they would intend to do, but it's one of the implications of this, that there would be differentiation here, that it might lead to extreme outcomes. That's number one. Number two, you might be thinking, well, yeah, okay, I can understand that, but is this hybrid thing really real? Go back and listen to the UFO hearings from about a year ago, maybe it was a year and a half ago, where Representative, I forget her name, but she's really disliked. So she's a rep.
Lauren Boebert.
Lauren Boebert. There you go. All you need to say is
I knew who you meant immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. People don't like her, but what's important here isn't whether you like her. It's the fact that she was asking a question based on information she'd received, and she answered them. She said, "It has come to our attention on the Hill that there is a secret genetic program where there is an attempt to augment human DNA with non-human DNA, potentially with a view to create hybrids." Can you confirm or deny that? And, the fact that she asks such a specific question implies that she and other people have been told about that. Recently, Matt Gaetz came out and talked about it. Frankly, a lot of people are beginning to talk about this, and the implications of it are really, really profound.
Have you seen the idea that, is it the CIA have used like 23andMe and ancient ancestry and all these things? Find out you're 10% Norwegian, 20% Mexican, 30% Scottish, and they're literally using this sort of stuff to get everyone's data to find out, actually, Jason, you've got NHI, genetics, Andy, you don't. And again, as wildly speculative as that is, that would be a very, very good way to do that data collection.
Yeah. I do not think it's speculative. I actually think, I think that it would be a classic move by the CIA or any organization to create a product which gives them access to what they need. The same thing they did with Facebook, right? They wanted to build a web of information on people's details. And so they created a tool which appeared to be a service for the end user, but was actually turning the end user into a product. I think exactly the same thing. And I think it makes a huge amount of sense, even in a world where the hybrid thing is BS. Frankly, there are many reasons why the intelligence community would want to build a huge map on genetics and people's DNA for all sorts of different reasons. So I do think, yes, that's something. And I suspect in view of this program, probably very important. And, who knows, when people talk about MILABS, military abductions, definitely think those are a real thing. It potentially, maybe they identify people with particular unique DNA and they want to very quickly just get access to them, and maybe in a context doing some sort of abduction or some sort of weird thing. Doesn't have to involve a spaceship or any of these other illusions they might put on. But that's interesting. There's two other things I'd mentioned on the hybrid thing, which I think are things that we don't talk about enough. Number one is this hierarchy of beings, which appears in Elizondo's book. It also appears in Pasolka's book. The idea is there's this idea that there's God, then there's angels, then there's off-world beings, and then there's groups of people in the intelligence community who appear to be higher up the food chain, and then there's normal people. That is an idea that's been disseminated through some of these books that I think is absolutely terrifying. Firstly, because it's introducing the religious component again. It's like, angels, really? Why are we calling them angels? Shouldn't we call them something else that's non-religious? But then you've also got this idea that there's some people on the planet who are superior to other people and that they're associated with the intelligence community. When Pasolka asks Timothy Taylor and says, explain to me what that is, and he just says, connect the dots. I don't know what that means, but it would seem to me that there might be a hybrid component on the planet that the intelligence community is aware of and maybe works with, that is a little bit further up the food chain than us, would be the way I would connect those dots. So it's a very terrifying thought. Again, in Elizondo's book, a similar model is suggested in his conversations with Jim Lukatsky. Jim Lukatsky's a Catholic, so maybe it makes more sense for him to have that model, but whatever. The other thing I'd point out is in DeLonge and Lavender's Secret Machines, I think it's the Man book, the second one, there's a really significant thing that's shared. And it's really unfortunate very few people have read those books and talk about them. But in that book, one of the advisors encourages DeLonge and Lavender to consider whether genocides may in fact be driven by the phenomenon itself, that it might be in the interest of the phenomenon to wipe out certain genetic profiles. And I'll give you a really good example about why that might be the case. Let's go back to the witches' Sabbath that we talked about earlier. There's a group of people in the 1600s or 1700s who are experiencing this weird abduction phenomenon involving like witches and demons. They don't know what it is. That group of people may have a genetic component which is making them more likely to have those experiences. There is an argument, and again, I can talk about this in a moment, there's other anecdotal evidence that suggests that your proclivity towards non-human experiences may be correlated to your genetic profile. So now, all of those people experiencing this weird witches' Sabbath phenomenon, what happens to them? They get killed. And so not only is that horrible, but there's a side effect here, which is it wipes out an entire lineage of people who may have had the genetic component required for those non-human experiences, for those strange things that kind of give them this weird experience. So is it possible that the phenomenon or even certain actors may have an interest in wiping out certain genetic profiles because those genetic profiles are more inclined to have certain experiences which they don't want them to have? Or could it be that, if human beings genuinely are hybrids, and maybe we do have some real magic inside of us, maybe our real destiny is tied to some race or beings who are, in some ways are powerful or divine. Maybe there's another part of the phenomenon that wants to slowly curb away that genetic material, slowly do away with its power and its capabilities so that we're easier to manage. And I don't know that that's the case, but the fact that it was suggested in DeLonge and Lavender's book by advisors, we're talking about McCaslin and Hayden and all of these people, is to me very concerning about how we view our modern state of geopolitics. So there's a lot of stuff in this hybrid conversation that deserves, I think, more consideration.
One famous statement that would immediately help clarify for me is Bob Bigelow on 60 Minutes saying they're here already, they walk amongst us. If it's literally us, and again, does that tie in with Avi Loeb's point around the von Neumann probes? We are the NHI, some of us are the NHI, and I can completely see your thinking and the point around if that is a part of this topic, and this is something that I just don't subscribe to the idea, and I know a lot of influency UFO celeb types like to do the whole, just come out and tell us everything, we can handle it. I would wager that we couldn't handle it as a species, everything we couldn't. Because when you go really deep in the weeds, I think we could handle the we are not alone. Like the confirmation that there's something else out there from a government would be fine. But it's the deeper conversations that then come from that over time that wouldn't happen within weeks, months, or years. You're probably looking at decades or even centuries
Yeah.
afterwards before you got down to those conversations. So like if that was the case, and I even think of things like, you know, the world of Harry Potter, where you've got, they all look human, but some of them are also wizards. But then you get some of them that are born into it. Hermione for the I read the books as a kid. Like Hermione's a muggle, but she's a really skilled wizard. So she was kind of brought into the world, and
Oh,
she's not liked by some of the wizards because they're like, you're not kind of pure blood type thing. And then you've got wizards that come in who don't mind that, and then you've got the mixing of these people. There are obviously far more sinister examples of that throughout history. You
yeah.
mentioned the Nazis and what happened there as well, and various other civilizations throughout time, where you probably would see a natural separation of, oh, I feel special. I've got this NHI component to me, and like maybe that does mean you've got some either power, ability, and does that mean you've also got folks who are kind of like NPCs, kind of non-playable characters who are just you you're just human, and that no
Mm,
longer becomes a special or unique thing. It does become a lesser thing on the totem pole. That hierarchy, which should be a really interesting way to kind of view it. But
yeah.
my favorite question I ever asked on the podcast that I would love to get a better answer for, was to George Knapp, where I asked him if he knew that the US government or parts of it could bring on abduction experiences if they could trigger them, because we often hear about them being able to, you know, summon UFOs, you can put nuclear material, or you can set certain frequencies, but can they bring on an abduction experience? And I don't mean they fly along in their own triangle and abduct someone, but literally they can set circumstances or whatever it may be that someone gets abducted. They can call almost like an intergalactic Uber, you know, via an app.
Oh,
And
interesting.
Nat was very much like, I don't want to go into that because it's a really dangerous part of the conversation. So
Wow.
wasn't a
Oh my
no, but
goodness.
very much he was like, yeah, that's not what I'm going to go into. So I would
That's
always love to know more
strange.
about that.
Yeah, yeah. I guess in the sense that you can do summoning or psionics, right? So if you can make one of these things appear, could you then trigger it to do? But that's very disturbing. Yeah,
A particular function, you know, as it there's a control system. An aspect of it is that abduction experience, whether it's a conscious one, whether it's a physical one, and that, you know, yeah, this set of circumstances, this piece of equipment, this genetic profile, all amounts to, it could mean you need a full moon, you know, has to be the third Tuesday of the month. But under this particular circumstance,
yeah,
we can have an abduction happen to someone. And I've always thought
yeah,
that would be a really fascinating aspect of it as well, and what that might pertain to.
yeah. I imagine people. I mean, this is when you're in this world. I suspect you ask all of these questions, don't you, about what could happen and how could you exploit this or use this. So uh, who knows? And I think Jim Semivan said if you knew some of the things that the government was working on, you can't even imagine them. So
Yeah,
yeah.
and that makes sense to me as well. You've brought up Tom DeLonge a few times, and he is really fascinating character in this whole conversation. When
Mhm.
did you start digging in to Tom DeLonge and his role and what's happening?
It was early. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it was. I remember listening to the first interviews and just being kind of blown away because at first I was like, he sounds nuts, and then I was like, whoa, he really seems the way he was speaking sounded sincere and like something wild was going on. And then I looked at the WikiLeaks emails and I was just like, oh, okay, like something's going on here. So I became very interested. And as I really decided to like stop being a passive viewer, there was a period where I would just tune in to your show and other people's shows and just listen. And it was great. But I decided I was going to like try and really study and take notes. The first thing I decided to do was to try and figure out what really happened with DeLonge and with To the Stars, because to me it was like, if I can find that this is a fraud, that tells me a lot of what I need to know about what's really going on here. If
Mm.
I find no evidence of that, if it just looks like an effort that was sort of they tried, they made a lot of mistakes and it didn't quite work, but it kind of did work, then that might change the way I look at it. And I came to the second conclusion ultimately, but I've been looking into it for a while, and I I always, when I'm trying to figure these things out, I get kind of obsessed because I don't have access to people. Like I don't have access to Tom or any of the people around him. all I could do was gather every single WikiLeaks email, every single journal entry from Valet, every single interview, news article, and put them all in a huge timeline and study them all until I felt like I understood a little bit better what was going on. And it's interesting. One thing I would say about DeLonge is a lot of people conflate what happened into, basically these people came after him and tried to use him as this mouthpiece. And I just do not think that's the case at all. A good example of that would be if you go back to 2011, there's an early interview that DeLonge did with George Knapp on Coast to Coast, where if you listen, he talks about a lot of the same things he ends up talking about in 2017. So a lot of these ideas didn't even come from his advisors. A lot of them came from himself. He was just reading very widely. He already had a plan to do activism pretty much back then. He created To the Stars in like 2014. It was just called To the Stars at that point, by the way. It wasn't To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences. And back then it was just a multimedia project. And I think what happened is this, okay? Again, if you go to Valet's journals, he will tell you in 2013, the people in the Valet Bigelow sort of space, that group of people, heard rumors that the White House was planning something called confirmation. So it wasn't disclosure. It was this kind of middle road out of the Obama administration. We're going to try and do this. And Valet goes from being skeptical. And by the time he talks about it the third time, he's like, well, we'll just have to see how it pans out. He clearly thinks there is a plan now. That circle included George Knapp. George Knapp's in touch with Tom DeLonge. Here's what I actually think. I think DeLonge knew that there was some wheels spinning. There was some momentum here that something was going to start happening. And so I think he was like, I'm just going to go all in. I'm convinced from all my contacts that there's a push here for something to happen. And so I think he was just like, right, I'm going to accelerate my project and I'm going to go and reach out to everyone I can. And he presented his ideas in a way, knowing that they were probably already working on this stuff, and got access. And I think that his pitch, ultimately, he probably, I don't want to claim he deceived them, but, he was promoting himself as like the world's biggest rock star with access to the entire youth. And I think these people are aerospace experts. They're not media people. They're intelligence experts. They're not people who understand, the young population. And so they bought into it. And in reality, DeLonge was overstretching, and the plan, they barely raised any money, and the reach of the books has been frankly very minimal, but the total impact of it has been good. But I don't think that the plan to disseminate these ideas to the youth, which was what he was proposing, really worked, which to me is a sign that this wasn't some huge conspiracy. It was just an idea that didn't go that well. And DeLonge certainly had a lot of different advisors, by the way. I would say that it seems to me that the people advising him didn't even agree with each other, because you have the likes of Jim Semivan, Chris Mellon, were looking at some of the things that the four-star admiral, who we don't know exactly who it is, might have been Inman. I don't know, Bobby Ray Inman. But then you also have General Michael Hayden, who's a 4-star. And they're saying things to Tom that seems more like a sort of a mythological Hollywood version of the stuff designed to engage people, less maybe designed to be very, very factual. And so Mellon and Samivan are like, why are they talking like this? And Valet's looking at it being like, I can't be involved in this. And then there's even other people who come in who, Bill Tompkins is one of them, who's one of the guys who perpetrates the most out there Nazi secret space stuff. And he's speaking with DeLonge. So I don't even think the claim that this is some kind of well-orchestrated conspiracy makes sense. Because if I was trying to orchestrate a conspiracy to get DeLonge to perpetrate a specific message, I wouldn't have him speaking with all of these people. I would have him speaking with one person, giving him a very clear sort of guide. But DeLonge takes all of these ideas, merges them with his own, and then writes a bunch of novels. And then him and Lavender get advice on how to write the nonfiction books. And, I think it was a legit attempt. And I think there's some very interesting things that come out of it. And right now, actually, what I'm working on is I think I've identified the real Maynard Consortium. So I don't know if you're familiar with Secret Machines, the novel. In there, for those of you, the book, a lot of people will hopefully have read it, but the novel covers a lot of ground. There's a lot of familiar stuff about flying saucers, Area 51, etc. It's not groundbreaking, but
Rich and secret families involvements and stuff like that. Yeah, it's audiobooks for me. I listened to the audiobooks, which I enjoyed.
I did the audiobook too. Yeah. And you know what? It's a decent story. It was engaging, especially if you're into the topic. But one of the interesting things in there is this Maynard Consortium, this idea that there's the aerospace companies, yes, there's the government, but there's this private thing behind it, which really is controlling the situation. And that's interesting because if you read the book and you really pay attention to the sections where he's talking about that, he gives very specific details. And on the cover of the book, for anyone who's not aware, it says this is a story based on real events. And DeLonge depicted it like that. And it was actually Jim Semivan, who would later work with DeLonge. He said in an interview with James Iandoli, he was like, yeah, well, the book had some really significant things in it that were frankly astonishing. And, people should really pay attention to it. James Iandoli goes, which bits are you talking about? And Jim's like, I don't want to talk about that. It's like, okay. But I think the Maynard Consortium might be the big part of that. So I'm about to do a new series on that story.
That'd be really cool. I think Tom DeLonge, a couple of things you mentioned there. One, it's not unfair to think that Tom DeLonge has gone on a similar journey to many of us in this topic. If you listen to me when I first started this 6 years ago, I have probably different opinions on a lot of things that I did now from then. And that includes people's agendas. That doesn't mean I know for certain or, but I allow based on what I know, what I hear, what you see, I'll form an opinion on it. And that's how I tend to work. So again, I'll use the example of right now, David Grush is a bit of a champion for most people in the UFO topic, including myself in terms of what he's done, what he seems to be, all that stuff, and we can come to Grush. But I'm running this one into the ground, Jason, but in my last few shows, I've used the Harvey Dent Two-Face comment around, you die the hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And that seems to be the case with most folks in most topics and areas. And Grush right now is the hero. Does he go down in flames or does he carry on? And in a few years' time, folks are sitting here going, David Grush, he was full of shit, blah, 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 for whatever reason. We don't know. It's just how a lot of this stuff plays out. So, like you say, DeLonge's been involved in the topic for a long time, has a lot of interest, has spoken, and had a lot of people try to or directly influence him. So it makes sense he's going to know some stuff that's correct, some stuff that's wrong, and maybe he's also just formed some of his own thoughts around that. He hears a half-truth, he hears something that could make sense, and he puts them together and goes, this is, for me, most likely what's the case. And that's no different, I think, to most of us with the UFO conversation. And then for DeLonge, for me, what I'd love you to do is talk around this aspect too. DeLonge's public story is kind of twofold. One, he was named in those Podesta emails, the WikiLeaks situation where John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, big into the UFO topic. We know Hillary Clinton is, and the idea was she would win the presidency. No one saw Trump storming on and doing that the first time round, and she would disclose. She would be the disclosure president. Somewhere Grant Cameron has just woken up, right, with me saying that. I've activated Grant Cameron and Stephen Bassett. It never happened. We know that. Trump came in. The rest is history, as they say. That could be totally redundant if Trump gives a disclosure speech today, but I'm very aware. But then you've also then got, okay, the other shift of tact is to the stars. And we have Elizondo, Chris Mellon, Putov, Semivan, Steve Justice, and these guys come out, and the big high-level picture was aliens are real. We're going to do this series, Unidentified, and it's going to interview people. It's going to talk about the phenomenon in a really serious way, and it was really well done. But also, we're going to fundraise and build a spaceship. We can't forget that was a claim they made, because they did. That was a promise they made. Things then went awry with To the Stars. A few different stories out there. What's your take then on? You're right, and you're like you say, Tom DeLonge definitely had an interest long before he was influenced. But what happened with Tom DeLonge after To the Stars, and kind of from there?
Yeah, like to go to the spaceship thing, I think everyone has a right to be like, what happened there? But ask yourself this, okay? They were raising money to try and do this. So they were using this public benefit corporation thing where people were going to buy shares. And I tried to buy shares, but it was so complicated. The process just didn't work because I really believed in what was going on in that moment.
I know lots of folks, Jason, that did. That's loads of. I didn't, but I know folks that did.
Yeah, it was it was a big moment, and they raised like $2 million, I think, in the end once all the checks had bounced and everything. So you got to ask yourself this question. People love to throw shade at to the stars, and there's loads of reasons to ask questions. But was it a Ponzi scheme or was it a conspiracy theory? If it was an attempt to suck up money into a black hole, then then you can make that argument and you can try and say like, oh, they were just trying to get people's money and they were never going to do anything. But if it's a conspiracy by the government to try and control the narrative, you would never, ever use a public funding mechanism. You would fund it through the appropriate channels and control it through the appropriate channels. But they didn't do that. Like, if this is the plan in people's minds, it's like the government is trying to perpetrate a narrative on this, which I definitely do think they are trying to do, by the way, but they're trying to do it through this mechanism. And given the stakes of everything involved, why would I, as the person running this conspiracy, be like, right, I've got all these actors here. And firstly, I'm going to muddy the waters by giving Tom like loads of contradictory people. So my message keeps getting muddled up. And I'm also going to create an organization which is trying to do 5 different things, which detracts from the clear goal. Mm-hmm. But now I'm going to fund it with public money, which exposes the organization in a completely new way, but also limits my ability to do what I want to do, because now there's only £2 million in the pot and I can only pay the basic bills, and I've got to fire. It's a terrible idea. So choose one theory. Do you want to accuse it of being a Ponzi scheme, of like trying to suck money up from the public? Or do you want to accuse it of being a government conspiracy? And that's one thing I would say is, like, to me, it just looks like a big mistake. It just looks like they overestimated and tried to do too many things. That's one thing. In terms of what happened to Tom, I think Tom won over the hearts and minds of the people that he interacted with. In Valet's journals, his first encounters with Tom, he's so impressed with him. You know, he says he's very sincere, he's very knowledgeable, all of this. And then later on, he talks about like, well, all these weird ideas are coming out, I'm not so sure about it. But, you know, I think what happened is, firstly, there was the Hillary Clinton situation, which is To the Stars was kind of tied to that. And I do think Clinton was going to be, she would have, what's happening now with Trump would have happened earlier. I think that's all that would have happened. There's an email in the WikiLeaks emails where Tom's General Neil McCaslin, obviously, who's the lead advisor, is writing out a presidential memorandum to be sent out in the event that she wins. And it basically describes, like, in light of the president's STEM policy, so science, technology, engineering, maths, we're going to be doing more research into this topic. It's very important. And so we're going to be gathering a few different parts of the government to work together. And I suspect it would have been very similar to like the NASA study or something. It would have been like, let's go and find new information out there, because this is part of confirmation, not disclosure. And DeLonge even used those terms, by the way, in conversation, showing that he was very clearly had the same ideas that Valet was talking about. This is not about lifting up all the dark stuff from the past and exposing people. This is about moving forwards and confirming alien life and all of that. What happened was, obviously, Trump won. There are some really interesting things about that, by the way. So think about this for a second. Humanity was on the verge of some form of like disclosure movement for the first time in a major way. And that's when the biggest political upset in human history happens. That's interesting. The other interesting thing here is Semivan talks about the WikiLeaks emails. He says it was hacked. They were hacked by the Russians, but Semivan describes it as a hostile, non-state intelligence network which may have been behind the hack. So for him, he sees it as a very specific move by maybe not even a government, but by like a hostile intelligence network to leak this information. I think it's interesting to consider, and this is something I'm still looking into, that Donald Trump's past may have more to do with the deep state and with some of these issues than people have historically realized. To give you an idea of this is just a bit of an off the side thing, and we'll go back to the stars. Trump, well, there was an organization called the Mary Carter Paint Company. It was a paint company, okay? So, but it also had like this weird CIA stuff going on. It's tied to some weird intelligence stuff, but it's a paint company. This paint company rebrands as a casino. It becomes a company called Resorts International. Never ever heard of a paint company becoming a real estate and resorts and casino business, but there you go. That new company acquires aerospace companies, which is really interesting, some of which NASA is using. And it also has its own private intelligence network called Intertel. Intertel, it's a very interesting private intelligence network which emerges. So you have this resorts company, which used to be a paint company, it's buying aerospace tech, and it has its own intelligence function. Who takes over Resorts International? It's Donald Trump. In the late 80s, whilst he's sitting on the board running the organization, he's sitting right next to the person who runs this hostile, sometimes hostile, intelligence network called Intertel. And I just think, I'm still teasing that story out, but I sometimes wonder, does Trump have more connections to shady private intelligence networks than we know about? And when WikiLeaks happened, whoever that hostile intelligence network is, what kinds of connections could it have? And I look at that as this weird moment where, there's this intelligence network leaking these emails, which has this UFO information, which leads to Trump coming in, but he used to run a weird hostile intelligence network. Anyway, I'm still teasing that out, but it's just interesting piece to play with. I wonder if anyone in the know, see some of that. Anyway,
just before you go back, does that tie in then though down the line with, was it Trump's uncle was involved in commandeering Tesla's notes when he died? That Trump's uncle was one of the guys in the room with the intel agency who literally took all the stuff.
Yeah. Trump's uncle, John Trump, was I think he worked with Vannevar Bush, one of the most senior scientists in the country. Such an expert on radar that I think after the war he was asked to look at like a bunch of Nazi stuff because they were ahead on radar. And yes, he was the guy asked to study Tesla's notes after he died. So if there's a list of scientists who would have been read in on stuff, there's no reason to think that John Trump wouldn't have been. So again, I think Trump is an enigma. Is he stupid? Is he clever? Is he connected? Is he just, it's sometimes it's hard to, you swing back and forth, but yes, I do think there might be more of a story with Trump, and especially with the deep state, because his mentor was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was connected to everyone and everything in the deep state. So yeah, interesting, very interesting.
And with so the guy no, on you go. What are you going to say?
I was going to say that the guy who beats out the effort for UFO disclosure in the Clinton election, I don't like Hillary Clinton, by the way, just FYI, but the guy who beats them out is deeply connected to the deep state in the biggest upsets in political history, right at the moment that we were going to get some UFO information. And I'm just not sure that all of that is a coincidence.
No, that's a fair way to think. Like you say, I would be interested to see what you could pull together on that in terms of research.
Yeah.
Regarding To the Stars Academy, is there some parallels to Skywatcher in terms of it being an organization that comes forward with former military folks who make some big claims, who go in what seems a lot of ways very public? They don't ask to raise money, but they're privately funded. They released some documentary episodes because Skywatcher did do that seemed it was going to be educational, informative. They had a plan. And then after some work, there seems to be some folks leave. So we had Elizondo and co with To the Stars. You have James Fowler with Skywatcher. Things change and it goes relatively quiet. There seems to be some parallels there for me. And is that perhaps getting it, like you say, they try to do something. They tried to do it in a public way. So forces within the government, whether it's Collins elite folks, whether it's just the military industrial complex, private contractors, or indeed just the US government itself going, whoa, not publicly. These things eventually get pulled back in.
Yeah, so I really don't know much about Skywatcher. I've not been involved in the drama. I never watched any of it. So I don't know. But yeah, I think there was clearly some kind of effort there and everyone's annoyed, right? Everyone's like, what happened to Skywatcher? And I think, again, it's one of these things where it's very easy to be like, oh, well, you said you were going to do it, so you didn't do it. So what? And it's like, no, I like the way you're positioning it, Andy. It's like the odds are that something has stopped that. And the intentions, like, why would you go out and say that stuff if you didn't have some kind of plan to try and follow through on it? And I especially when there's so many other people involved. So yeah, I think these kinds of things do face resistance, and To the Stars certainly did. I think they were facing all sorts of people trying to maybe muddy the waters and mess with them. So I think it's just part of the game.
In regard, what we'll do is we'll finish up on To the Stars, because I am only halfway through the notes I've got, Jason. And I said that to you that beforehand, and I mean that, folks. I've broken this up into something like 18 parts, and I'm about to go into part 9, which is Tom DeLonge, Atlantis, Nazis, Greek gods, and myths.
So I've got about 15 minutes now before I'd have to wrap up. So are we okay to wrap then?
100%, yeah, because I've got some stuff on, and it's going to get hot for both of us, folks.
Yeah.
So what we'll do is give us a final word there, Jason, because we'll get you back on next week if we can do an early recording.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
And we'll do this again and go into that kind of stuff, because I'll give folks a tease here. I want to get into the kind of talking about Atlantis, Nazis, Greek gods, what's happened from 2017 onwards, the New York Times, the Congress, the whistleblower era that we're currently in, agendas, information control, Collins elite in the modern era, and then I've got listener questions on top of that too. So loads still to get to, Jason, but give us a final word then on, can I summarize right now where everything is for you? We've discussed the relevancy of it, why it's so important, and what's kind of driving you to keep covering this.
Yeah. Right now, what seems really important to me is that the religious thing has been a big concern for me, obviously because of my religious background, but also because I think we have to be so cautious about, as we do have to integrate religion into this conversation, but how we do it completely changes things. So do you just go in and say, okay, well, the Bible is some sort of authority here, because then we have to fit everything around the Bible? Or do we say the data is the authority and we fit not just the Bible, but any mythological traditions around the data? And I think that second approach is so important. I don't have to tell you about the weird eschatological stuff happening in the world, conflicts in the Middle East, the way they're sometimes framed as holy wars. You've got Peter Thiel warning about the Antichrist. There's a lot of heightened emotion, which is using religious terminology. And the last thing we want to do as a community is to play into that. I'm encouraged. Like I said earlier, I'm less worried than I was. Not like it's me having to solve this, but my own personal thoughts. But that's something that I'm aware of, and really beyond that, I'm also very aware now that things do seem to be moving forwards, and it's been a decade or so of this push. By the time we get to another 2 or 3 years, I would not be surprised if there is more conversation in public. And if certain things, I don't know whether the government's ever going to confirm anything, but the conversation's going to change. And so for me now, a big interest of mine is not, I don't want to spend my time trying to argue for non-human intelligence. I'm more concerned with how are we going to frame it, like whether it's the risks of the hybrid thing or the religious thing or whatever. And then also, how do we make sure that whilst this public confirmation level conversation is going on, we're also having the deeper conversation where we are looking at the past. We are looking at all the wild stuff that happened after the war, and we're not forgetting it, because I think making sure that's happening in tandem with the adjustment that the public's going through is going to be very important.
Awesome. Jason, obviously you're going to come back on next week. How can people find you, your content, your channel, to look into a lot of the stuff we've talked about? You've done huge summaries and deep dives on. So we have kind of, like you say, we've been you used the 7-course analogy earlier. We've been the buffet for your channel, where we've literally taken little samples of each of the meals to try.
Yeah, if you want to go deeper, then go to the YouTube channel. It's just Jason Samosa. Where I like to say that we're now at a point where if you type that in, you won't just see images of Jason Momoa as a samosa. Although if you Google that, you will scroll down far enough, you will find that image, and it haunts me every day. But on YouTube, you should find it, or just type Jason Samosa UFO. And I'm on X as well as Jason Samosa, and I post on there, here and there. And that's I'm on all socials. So yeah.
Awesome. Jason, great conversation. I've loved hearing a lot of your thoughts on this. Gave me a lot of food for thought, and I hope it's done for folks out there too. And remember, if you're on any platform of mine's or Jason's, a like, a comment, a subscribe, anything like that, leaving a question means a lot and helps people like us grow our content. And great to hear, Jason, you're able to do this now full time, which is wonderful given the effort you've been putting in.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it. And let me just say, it's really cool to be on that UFO podcast. Like I said, used to listen to this all the time back in the day. So it's super cool. Appreciate you having me on.
And I can appreciate anyone listening to this and deciding I can do that better. So starting their own channel, Jason. So well done. So I've been the inspiration for many folks in that respect. So look forward to speaking to you again very soon, mate.
Thanks. Appreciate it.